I came home from a 3-day trip to find the heavy steel door of my workshop locked. Not just locked, but barred by a brand new, glowing smart lock. My daughter-in-law stepped out, smiled her perfect plastic smile, and told me she had turned my 40-year-old sanctuary into a nursery without even asking me. She said the baby needed the room. I did not scream. I did not argue. I just looked around, quietly, nodded, and proceeded to execute a plan that would leave her and my son begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind ungrateful family members exactly whose house they are living in. My name is William Caldwell, but everyone just calls me Bill. I am 70 years old, and for my entire adult life I have been a master woodworker and furniture restorer. I live on a sprawling, beautiful estate in Bellevue, Washington. It is a place I bought decades ago, back when it was just a modest patch of dirt and wild trees. My late wife Patty and I built our lives on that land. We poured our blood, our sweat, and every single dime we earned into making it a home. For the past few days, I had been down in Oregon. I was driving my old pickup truck, the bed loaded down with heavy, gorgeous slabs of solid oak I had hand-selected from a specialty mill. The drive back up to Washington was long, and the constant rain hitting the windshield had me feeling the ache in my bones. But honestly, I did not mind the drive or the ache. I was excited. All I could think about was getting back to my workshop. Let me tell you about this workshop, because it is not just some little tool shed in the backyard. It is a massive 1,500 square foot professional studio that sits right on the estate, completely insulated and built exactly to my specifications. Inside those walls sat over $300,000 worth of customized woodworking machinery. I am talking about industrial-grade table saws, heavy-duty lathes, commercial planers, and a custom dust collection system that Patty and I installed ourselves. That workshop was my sanctuary. Ever since Patty passed away, it was the only place where I still felt completely whole. The smell of fresh sawdust, the scent of cedar and pine, the hum of the machines. It was the only place where the ghosts of my past felt like comforting friends, rather than painful memories. When I was in there, my hands covered in sawdust, I could almost hear Patty humming her favorite songs while she stained the wood. I had let my son Derek and his wife Monica move into the main house of the estate a few years ago. I did it to help them save money, to give them a solid foundation to build their lives. I took the smaller attached mother-in-law suite for myself because all I really needed was a bed, a coffee pot, and a short walk to my shop. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was providing for my family. I had no idea I was just handing the keys of my kingdom over to people who saw me as an inconvenience. I pulled my truck into the long driveway of the Bellevue estate. The afternoon sky was gray and overcast, typical for Washington, and the air was biting cold. I turned off the engine, listening to the heavy silence that settled over the property. The main house looked quiet. The curtains were drawn. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out of the truck, and stretched my stiff back. I did not even bother going into my suite to drop off my travel bag. I just wanted to see my shop. I wanted to run my hands over the smooth steel of my workbench and breathe in the familiar scent of timber. I walked around the side of the main house, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The large, heavy steel door of my workshop came into view. I reached into the pocket of my thick canvas jacket, my fingers brushing against the heavy brass key that had unlocked that door for over 40 years. But as I stepped up to the entrance, I froze. My hand stopped moving. The old brass handle, the one worn smooth by decades of my touch, was gone. In its place was a sleek black glass keypad, a high-tech smart lock. A small red light blinked at me from the top of the digital screen, mocking me. I stood there in the cold air, completely paralyzed. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. A heavy sinking dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. I reached out, my calloused fingers hovering over the glowing numbers. I pressed the handle, pulling it downward. It did not budge. The heavy steel door was completely locked down. It was a physical, impenetrable barrier between me and my entire life. Confusion swirled in my head. Did Derek install this for security while I was away? Why would he not call and tell me? Why would he change the locks on my own building without giving me the code? I pulled on the handle again, this time with more force. The metal rattled in its frame, but the electronic deadbolt held firm. The red light blinked again. Access denied. I stepped back, staring at the door. The sheer disrespect of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not just a locked door. This was an invasion. This was someone coming into my private world, taking my 40-year-old sanctuary and locking me out of it. The machines inside the half-finished rocking chair I was carving the hand tools that Patty had bought me for our 20th anniversary. All of it was trapped behind a digital code I did not know. A cold wind blew across the backyard, rustling the bare branches of the oak trees Patty and I had planted when Derek was just a little boy. I looked at the main house. The lights were off, but I knew they were in there. I knew Monica was in there. My breathing grew shallow, and a tight knot formed in my throat. I had spent my entire life working to provide for my son. I had given up the massive main house so he and his wife could live comfortably. I had asked for nothing in return, only that they respect my space and my peace. And this is how they repaid me. By locking me out of the only place in the world that still felt like mine. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists against the steel door. Decades of working with dangerous machinery had taught me that losing your temper only leads to accidents. You have to be precise. You have to be calculated. You have to measure twice and cut once. I slowly pulled my hand away from the smart lock. The red light faded, leaving the keypad dark and cold. I stood in the quiet backyard of the estate I owned, feeling like an absolute stranger on my own land. The feeling of betrayal was so sharp, so deep, that it actually took my breath away. But beneath that betrayal, a very quiet, very dangerous realization began to take root. They thought I was just a tired old man. They thought I would just roll over, accept whatever excuse they threw at me, and quietly fade into the background of their lives. They were wrong. So incredibly wrong. I looked at the wood loaded in the back of my truck. Beautiful, expensive Oregon oak. I had spent hours hand-picking those slabs, visualizing the dining table I was going to build. I had pictured the sawdust flying from my saw, the satisfaction of a perfectly smooth edge. Now those slabs of wood felt like a heavy burden. Where was I supposed to put them? Where was I supposed to go? I turned my gaze back to the glowing black lock. It was such a small device, yet it represented a massive violation of boundaries. I felt my jaw tighten. I remembered the days when Derek was just a toddler sitting on a wooden stool in the corner of this very shop watching me work. I remembered teaching him how to sand a piece of pine until it was as smooth as glass. I remembered telling him that a man is only as good as his word, and that respect is something you earn, not something you demand. It seemed he had forgotten all of those lessons. Or worse, his wife had systematically erased them from his mind. Monica had always looked at my workshop with a thinly veiled expression of disdain. To her, it was just a dirty shed taking up valuable real estate in the backyard. She never saw the art. She never saw the passion. She only saw square footage. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy Washington air fill my lungs. I reached into my pocket and gripped the useless brass key. I did not throw it away. I kept it tightly in my fist as a reminder of exactly what had been stolen from me today. I was 70 years old, but my mind was as sharp as the chisel blades sitting locked inside that room. I was going to find out exactly what they had done to my shop. And then I was going to teach them a lesson they would never ever forget. I came home from a 3-day trip to find the heavy steel door of my workshop locked. Not just locked, but barred by a brand new glowing smart lock. My daughter-in-law stepped out, smiled her perfect plastic smile, and told me she had turned my 40-year-old sanctuary into a nursery without even asking me. She said the baby needed the room. I did not scream. I did not argue. I just looked around, quietly nodded, and proceeded to execute a plan that would leave her and my son begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind ungrateful family members exactly whose house they are living in. My name is William Caldwell, but everyone just calls me Bill. I am 70 years old, and for my entire adult life I have been a master woodworker and furniture restorer. I live on a sprawling, beautiful estate in Bellevue, Washington. It is a place I bought decades ago, back when it was just a modest patch of dirt and wild trees. My late wife Patty and I built our lives on that land. We poured our blood, our sweat, and every single dime we earned into making it a home. For the past few days, I had been down in Oregon. I was driving my old pickup truck, the bed loaded down with heavy, gorgeous slabs of solid oak I had hand-selected from a specialty mill. The drive back up to Washington was long, and the constant rain hitting the windshield had me feeling the ache in my bones. But honestly, I did not mind the drive or the ache. I was excited. All I could think about was getting back to my workshop. Let me tell you about this workshop, because it is not just some little tool shed in the backyard. It is a massive 1,500 square foot professional studio that sits right on the estate, completely insulated and built exactly to my specifications. Inside those walls sat over $300,000 worth of customized woodworking machinery. I am talking about industrial-grade table saws, heavy-duty lathes, commercial planers, and a custom dust collection system that Patty and I installed ourselves. That workshop was my sanctuary. Ever since Patty passed away, it was the only place where I still felt completely whole. The smell of fresh sawdust, the scent of cedar and pine, the hum of the machines. It was the only place where the ghosts of my past felt like comforting friends rather than painful memories. When I was in there, my hands covered in sawdust, I could almost hear Patty humming her favorite songs while she stained the wood. I had let my son Derek and his wife Monica move into the main house of the estate a few years ago. I did it to help them save money, to give them a solid foundation to build their lives. I took the smaller attached mother-in-law suite for myself because all I really needed was a bed, a coffee pot, and a short walk to my shop. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was providing for my family. I had no idea I was just handing the keys of my kingdom over to people who saw me as an inconvenience. I pulled my truck into the long driveway of the Bellevue estate. The afternoon sky was gray and overcast, typical for Washington, and the air was biting cold. I turned off the engine, listening to the heavy silence that settled over the property. The main house looked quiet. The curtains were drawn. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out of the truck, and stretched my stiff back. I did not even bother going into my suite to drop off my travel bag. I just wanted to see my shop. I wanted to run my hands over the smooth steel of my workbench and breathe in the familiar scent of timber. I walked around the side of the main house, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The large, heavy steel door of my workshop came into view. I reached into the pocket of my thick canvas jacket, my fingers brushing against the heavy brass key that had unlocked that door for over 40 years. But as I stepped up to the entrance, I froze. My hand stopped moving. The old brass handle, the one worn smooth by decades of my touch, was gone. In its place was a sleek black glass keypad, a high-tech smart lock. A small red light blinked at me from the top of the digital screen, mocking me. I stood there in the cold air, completely paralyzed. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. A heavy sinking dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. I reached out, my calloused fingers hovering over the glowing numbers. I pressed the handle, pulling it downward. It did not budge. The heavy steel door was completely locked down. It was a physical, impenetrable barrier between me and my entire life. Confusion swirled in my head. Did Derek install this for security while I was away? Why would he not call and tell me? Why would he change the locks on my own building without giving me the code? I pulled on the handle again, this time with more force. The metal rattled in its frame, but the electronic deadbolt held firm. The red light blinked again. Access denied. I stepped back, staring at the door. The sheer disrespect of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not just a locked door. This was an invasion. This was someone coming into my private world, taking my 40-year-old sanctuary and locking me out of it. The machines inside the half-finished rocking chair I was carving the hand tools that Patty had bought me for our 20th anniversary. All of it was trapped behind a digital code I did not know. A cold wind blew across the backyard, rustling the bare branches of the oak trees Patty and I had planted when Derek was just a little boy. I looked at the main house. The lights were off, but I knew they were in there. I knew Monica was in there. My breathing grew shallow, and a tight knot formed in my throat. I had spent my entire life working to provide for my son. I had given up the massive main house so he and his wife could live comfortably. I had asked for nothing in return, only that they respect my space and my peace. And this is how they repaid me. By locking me out of the only place in the world that still felt like mine. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists against the steel door. Decades of working with dangerous machinery had taught me that losing your temper only leads to accidents. You have to be precise. You have to be calculated. You have to measure twice and cut once. I slowly pulled my hand away from the smart lock. The red light faded, leaving the keypad dark and cold. I stood in the quiet backyard of the estate I owned, feeling like an absolute stranger on my own land. The feeling of betrayal was so sharp, so deep, that it actually took my breath away. But beneath that betrayal, a very quiet, very dangerous realization began to take root. They thought I was just a tired old man. They thought I would just roll over, accept whatever excuse they threw at me, and quietly fade into the background of their lives. They were wrong. So incredibly wrong. I looked at the wood loaded in the back of my truck. Beautiful, expensive Oregon oak. I had spent hours hand-picking those slabs, visualizing the dining table I was going to build. I had pictured the sawdust flying from my saw, the satisfaction of a perfectly smooth edge. Now those slabs of wood felt like a heavy burden. Where was I supposed to put them? Where was I supposed to go? I turned my gaze back to the glowing black lock. It was such a small device, yet it represented a massive violation of boundaries. I felt my jaw tighten. I remembered the days when Derek was just a toddler sitting on a wooden stool in the corner of this very shop watching me work. I remembered teaching him how to sand a piece of pine until it was as smooth as glass. I remembered telling him that a man is only as good as his word, and that respect is something you earn, not something you demand. It seemed he had forgotten all of those lessons. Or worse, his wife had systematically erased them from his mind. Monica had always looked at my workshop with a thinly veiled expression of disdain. To her, it was just a dirty shed taking up valuable real estate in the backyard. She never saw the art. She never saw the passion. She only saw square footage. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy Washington air fill my lungs. I reached into my pocket and gripped the useless brass key. I did not throw it away. I kept it tightly in my fist, as a reminder of exactly what had been stolen from me today. I was 70 years old, but my mind was as sharp as the chisel blades sitting locked inside that room. I was going to find out exactly what they had done to my shop. And then I was going to teach them a lesson they would never, ever forget. I stood there for a long time, until the back door of the main house finally opened. Monica stepped out onto the patio, wrapping a designer shawl around her shoulders against the Washington chill. She walked down the gravel path, a sweet, perfectly practiced smile painted on her face. Derek trailed a few steps behind her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, unable to meet my gaze. She stopped a few feet from me, looking at the smart lock, then at my face. "Oh, Bill, you are home early," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We wanted to surprise you. Derek and I decided to convert the shop into a nursery. The baby needs a toxin-free space, you know. All that sawdust and those harsh chemicals are just not safe for my pregnancy." She claimed they had carefully moved all my machinery to the old leaky garden shed behind the property line to keep it safe. I looked at Derek. He stared at his expensive shoes, nodding submissively without saying a single word. I did not scream. I just smiled a cold, empty smile, and told them I understood. I walked away to my small suite, locking the door behind me. I waited. For 40 years, I had built my life on the foundation of honest physical labor. My hands had shaped dining tables where families gathered for Thanksgiving. I had carved intricate bed frames where children slept. I understood the nature of wood. Wood is honest. If you treat it with respect, it yields beautiful results. If you force it, if you rush the blade, it splinters and breaks. I had tried to raise my son with those same principles. I had taught Derek that integrity was not something you could buy, but something you had to build day by day, choice by choice. Sitting in the dark, watching the shadows stretch across my small living room, I realized that my lessons had failed. Derek had allowed his wife to poison his character. He had traded his integrity for the illusion of status, letting her orchestrate the theft of my property, while he stood by silent and cowardly. I sat in the dark of my small living room watching the clock on the microwave tick forward. The rain had started to fall again, a steady rhythmic drumming against the window panes. By midnight, the lights in the main house had gone completely dark. I gave them 2 more hours. At exactly 2 in the morning, I stood up. I did not bother putting on a heavy coat. I walked over to the small closet where I kept my emergency tools. I pulled out a heavy-duty battery-powered mini angle grinder. I slipped a fresh cutting disc onto the spindle and tightened the nut. I grabbed a high-lumen tactical flashlight and slipped it into my pocket. Stepping out into this freezing rain, the yard was pitch black. I moved silently across the wet grass, avoiding the gravel path, so my footsteps would not make a sound. I reached the heavy steel door of my workshop. The red light of the smart lock blinked in the darkness. They really thought a piece of consumer-grade electronics was going to keep a master fabricator out of his own building. I pressed the grinder against the edge of the smart lock assembly. I hit the power switch. The grinder roared to life, a high-pitched whine that was immediately muffled by the heavy rain and the howling wind. Sparks flew in a brilliant shower of orange and yellow, illuminating the dark patio. I angled the blade perfectly, slicing through the hardened steel mounting bracket and the internal deadbolt mechanism. It took less than 45 seconds. The expensive lock died with a metallic clatter separating from the doorframe. I caught the heavy metal casing before it could hit the concrete floor and placed it silently on the ground. I gripped the door handle and pulled. The heavy hinges groaned slightly, a familiar sound I had heard 10,000 times before. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, plunging myself into total darkness. The air inside the workshop was completely wrong. The rich, comforting aroma of aged cedar and fresh pine was completely gone. In its place was the sharp, sterile stench of wet concrete, industrial glue, and drywall dust. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the tactical flashlight from my jacket pocket and clicked it on. The bright white beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the room. I stopped breathing. The massive space, my sanctuary for 4 decades, had been completely gutted. There was no crib. There was no changing table. There were no pastel-painted walls or soft rugs for a baby to crawl on. The polished concrete floor, which I had swept clean every single night for 40 years, had been brutally jackhammered open. Deep, jagged trenches ran the entire length of the room, exposing raw dirt and newly laid commercial plumbing pipes. Thick bundles of heavy electrical wiring hung down from the ceiling like exposed nerves. My massive workbench, the one I had built from reclaimed barnwood, was gone. My industrial table saw was gone. My lathe was gone. Everything was gone. In the center of the room, sitting over a patch of unbroken concrete, was a makeshift desk made from a cheap piece of plywood laid over 2 plastic sawhorses. I walked over to it, my boots crunching on chunks of broken masonry. I shined my light onto the plywood. Several large, glossy architectural blueprints were rolled out across the surface, weighed down by empty coffee cups. I leaned in, tracing the bright beam over the professional schematic drawings. Printed in bold, clear black letters at the top right corner of the page was the title of the project. It read, "Luxury Airbnb Rental and Yoga Studio." I stared at those words. until the letters began to blur. Luxury Airbnb rental and yoga studio. The nursery was a complete fabrication. The story about needing a toxin-free space for the baby was nothing but a calculated, manipulative lie used to disarm me. Monica had weaponized her supposed pregnancy, using the unborn child as a moral shield to justify the complete destruction of my life work. She knew that a grandfather could not argue against the safety of his grandchild without sounding like a monster. It was a brilliant sociopathic strategy. They had completely eradicated my presence from this space not to build a family, but to build a commercial rental unit. They were converting my passion into a passive income stream for themselves, and they had done it while I was out of town, hoping the shock would force me into quiet submission. The coldness of the betrayal washed over me, chilling me far deeper than the winter rain outside. I slowly ran my bare hand across the glossy paper, feeling the cold, hard reality of their deception. The blueprints were incredibly detailed, showing high-end finishes, a sunken soaking tub, and custom lighting fixtures. They had even planned out a separate private entrance path to ensure their paying guests would never have to interact with me. Every single line drawn on that paper was an insult, a profound disrespect. It was a visual representation of how little I mattered to them. They were not just stealing the physical space of my workshop. They were trying to erase me from the estate entirely. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in this room creating pieces of art that brought joy to people. Now all of that beautiful, irreplaceable history was being violently bulldozed for a quick, cheap cash grab. The sheer scale of the renovation was staggering. Commercial plumbing, high-end electrical upgrades, structural changes to the roofline. This kind of work cost a fortune. Tens of thousands of dollars easily. Where was that money coming from? Derek made a good salary, but I knew his spending habits. They lived paycheck to paycheck, completely consumed by keeping up appearances. They did not have the cash reserves to fund a massive high-end commercial remodel. Something was incredibly wrong. The financial math simply did not add up. The destruction of my shop was not just an act of extreme disrespect. It was a desperate, panicked maneuver. They needed a new income stream, and they needed it immediately. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the ruined workshop back into absolute darkness. I quietly stood there in the silent, cold room, listening to the heavy rain hammer against the metal roof. The crushing sadness I had felt earlier today was now entirely gone. It had been completely incinerated, quickly replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a man who had just discovered a ruthless enemy operating deep inside his very own home. I stepped back out into the freezing rain and carefully pulled the heavy steel door shut behind me. The ruined workshop disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the howling wind. My boots sank into the muddy grass as I turned my attention toward the far back corner of the estate. Monica had explicitly told me that all my machinery had been carefully moved to the old garden shed to keep it safe. I needed to see it. I needed to know the condition of my tools. The walk across the lawn felt incredibly long. The rain soaked through the shoulders of my canvas jacket, sending a deep chill straight into my bones. But the icy weather was nothing compared to the cold fury steadily pumping through my veins. The property line was shrouded in shadows, heavily overgrown with thick blackberry brambles that Patty and I had always meant to clear out. Tucked away behind those thorny vines sat the old wooden garden shed. It was a rotting, dilapidated structure that had been standing on the property since before we even bought the land. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, missing dozens of shingles, and the wooden siding was soft and green with decades of moss and decay. It was barely fit to store rusted rakes and broken clay pots. The idea that someone would store highly sensitive, precision-calibrated woodworking machinery inside that damp, moldy death trap was an absolute insult. Moisture is the ultimate enemy of cast iron and exposed steel. Even a few days in a humid environment could cause surface rust to bloom across the polished tables of my saws and jointers. I reached the shed and shined my tactical flashlight over the exterior. The cheap metal latch on the double doors was held shut by a rusted combination padlock. I recognized it immediately. It was the same cheap lock I had tossed into a junk drawer 5 years ago. I did not bother trying to remember the code. I simply raised my heavy steel boot and kicked the center of the wooden doors with all the strength I could muster in my 70-year-old legs. The rotted wood splintered instantly around the latch, and the doors burst open, swinging violently outward on their rusted hinges. A heavy, suffocating wave of stale air, smelling strongly of wet dirt, mildew, and decaying leaves, rolled out of the darkness to greet me. I stood in the doorway for a brief moment, listening to the rain beat down on the fragile roof overhead. Water was actively dripping through the massive gaps in the ceiling, splashing onto the soft, muddy floor inside. I tightened my grip on the heavy aluminum body of my flashlight, bracing myself for the heartbreaking sight of my beautiful machines sitting in the mud, exposed to the brutal elements. I raised my arm and clicked the beam of light forward, sweeping it from the left corner of the rotting structure all the way to the right. The bright white circle of light illuminated the back wall, then the floor, then the corners. I stopped moving. I stopped breathing. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand as I swept it across the space a second time, praying that my old eyes were playing tricks on me in the darkness. But the harsh, undeniable reality of the situation stared back at me. The shed was completely empty. There were no heavy canvas tarps. There were no table saws. There were no drill presses, band saws, or jointers. There was absolutely nothing inside except a few dead spiders and a broken wooden pallet sitting in a puddle of muddy water. My heart dropped like a stone hitting the bottom of my stomach with a sickening thud. I stepped fully inside the damp structure, shining the light into the uppermost rafters, checking behind the open doors, searching for anything. A single hand plane, a set of chisels, a stray clamp. But the space was completely bare. The total absence of my life work echoed loudly in the small rotting room. The sheer physical weight of the machinery meant that it could not be easily hidden. We are talking about thousands of pounds of cast iron and steel. My custom-built commercial table saw alone weighed nearly 800 pounds. It required a hydraulic lift and 3 strong men just to move it across a smooth concrete floor. I lowered the flashlight, pointing the beam toward the muddy ground, and closed my eyes. A vivid memory flooded my mind, hitting me with a wave of profound sorrow. I thought about my heavy-duty commercial lathe. It was a beautiful, massive piece of engineering painted deep industrial green with a variable speed motor that purred like a luxury car engine. I had spent countless hours standing in front of that specific machine covered head to toe in fine wood dust, carefully guiding my sharpest gouges along spinning blocks of walnut and cherry. That lathe was not just a tool. It was the exact machine I had used to turn the intricate sweeping legs and spindles for Patty's rocking chair. I remember the exact evening I finished it. It was our 30th wedding anniversary. I had brought her out to the workshop, blindfolded her, and guided her to the center of the room. When she opened her eyes and saw the gleaming, perfectly polished mahogany chair sitting under the warm shop lights, she had wept. She sat in it, running her hands over the smooth, rounded armrests I had spent weeks sanding to perfection. She told me it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever created for her. That lathe held the memory of her tears of joy. It held the history of my devotion to her. It was a tangible connection to the woman I loved more than anything in this world. And now it was gone. Stolen. I opened my eyes, the cold reality of the situation sharpening my focus. Monica had looked me dead in the eye and swore that everything had been carefully moved to this exact spot. It was a lie of monstrous proportions. $300,000 worth of highly specialized industrial-grade woodworking equipment does not simply vanish into thin air. You cannot quietly pack a massive edge sander or a commercial dust collection system into the back of a luxury SUV. Moving an entire professional workshop requires heavy logistical coordination. It requires specialized riggers, heavy-duty flatbed trucks, and pallet jacks. It requires time, effort, and buyers. They did not just move my machinery. They liquidated it. They had completely sold off 40 years of my passion, my art, and my financial investment. I stood in the empty, dripping shed, piecing the horrible puzzle together. To liquidate highly specialized equipment that quickly, you have to sell it at an extreme discount to commercial liquidators or industrial scrap buyers who ask no questions and pay in cold, hard cash. They had likely sold $300,000 worth of pristine equipment for pennies on the dollar. The sheer financial violence of the act was staggering. Why would my son, a man who earned a very comfortable six-figure corporate salary, allow his wife to orchestrate the fire sale of his own father's legacy? Why would they go to such extreme criminal lengths to generate immediate cash? I paced the length of the muddy shed, the cold rain blowing in through the shattered double doors. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifying. The fake nursery, the gutted workshop, the expensive commercial plumbing being laid for an Airbnb rental, and the total rapid liquidation of my heavy machinery. Every single action pointed directly to a desperate, blinding need for immediate capital. Derek and Monica were drowning. They were hemorrhaging money somewhere, and they were willing to cannibalize my property to plug the hole. I thought about the luxury cars parked in their driveway. I thought about the designer clothes Monica constantly paraded around in and the lavish vacations they took multiple times a year. They were living a lifestyle designed purely for social media, an endless performance of wealth and success. But true wealth does not behave this way. True wealth does not panic and sell off family assets to fund a backyard renovation. They were desperately trying to build a rental unit to generate passive income because their primary income was no longer enough to sustain their massive illusion. They were bleeding cash, and instead of cutting back, instead of living within their actual means, they had decided to sacrifice me. I stepped out of the rotting shed and back into the freezing rain. The crushing sorrow evaporated, leaving a hard, impenetrable layer of pure resolve. They had wildly miscalculated. I gripped the heavy flashlight securely in my hand. I was going to find out exactly how much hidden debt they were desperately attempting to cover up behind my very own back. I stood in the freezing rain, the icy water soaking through my canvas jacket and chilling my skin. The heat of my anger kept me perfectly steady. I looked toward the main house. The dark windows of the master bedroom stared back at me. A powerful, primal urge surged through my chest. I wanted to march up those steps, kick the front door off its hinges, and drag my son out of his warm bed. I wanted to scream until my voice went hoarse. I wanted to demand answers, to throw the reality of his cowardice right in his face, and to watch Monica scramble for another one of her pathetic, manipulative lies. It would have been so easy to let the rage take over. It would have been satisfying for about 5 minutes to unleash the absolute fury of a betrayed father, but screaming would accomplish nothing. Decades of running my own business and negotiating difficult contracts had taught me that the person who loses their temper is the person who loses the war. If I woke them up now, I would be handing them the ultimate advantage. I would be giving them time. Time to spin a new web of lies, time to hide whatever financial disaster they were covering up, and time to manipulate the situation to make me look like an unhinged, irrational old man. I refused to give them that power. I was not going to be a victim in my own home. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but they did not shake. I opened the camera application and turned on the flash. I raised the phone and pointed it into the dark, rotting interior of the garden shed. The bright flash illuminated the damp, muddy floor and the broken wooden pallet. I pressed the capture button. I took another photo from a different angle, ensuring the sheer emptiness of the space was perfectly documented. I photographed the rusted padlock I had kicked open and the splintered wood of the shed doors. Every picture was a piece of ammunition. I was no longer a grieving father trying to understand his family. I was a man building an airtight case against a pair of ruthless thieves. I turned my back on the empty shed and walked across the muddy lawn, heading straight for the gutted workshop. The rain washed the dirt from my boots as I moved with quiet, deliberate purpose. I slipped through the heavy steel door, closing it silently behind me to block out the howling wind. The thick smell of concrete dust and industrial adhesive hit me again, but this time it did not break my heart. It only sharpened my focus. I raised my phone and began to systematically document the destruction of my sanctuary. The camera flash strobed rapidly in the darkness, capturing the brutal reality of their greed. I photographed the deep trenches jackhammered into my pristine concrete floor. I made sure to get clear, high-resolution shots of the thick commercial plumbing pipes laid into the dirt. I photographed the heavy bundles of electrical wiring dangling dangerously from the exposed ceiling joists. I moved slowly and methodically, capturing every angle of the unauthorized demolition. These were not just pictures of a ruined workshop. They were undeniable proof of a massive, unpermitted commercial renovation taking place on my property without my consent. I walked over to the makeshift plywood desk sitting in the center of the room. I aimed my phone at the architectural blueprints scattered across the surface. I took a wide shot of the entire desk, then leaned in close to photograph the title block. The words "Luxury Airbnb Rental and Yoga Studio" filled the frame of my camera. I took pictures of the floor plans capturing the detailed schematics for the sunken, soaking tub, the high-end lighting fixtures, and the private entrance path designed to keep their paying guests completely separated from me. As I photographed the blueprints, my mind began to run the numbers. I had managed construction projects before. I knew exactly what this level of commercial renovation cost in the current market. The plumbing and electrical work alone would run upward of $40,000. The luxury finishes, the custom fixtures, and the structural modifications would easily push the total budget past $100,000. Monica and Derek did not have that kind of money sitting in a checking account. Even with Derek earning a comfortable corporate salary, their lavish lifestyle consumed every penny they made. They drove luxury vehicles, wore designer clothing, and took expensive vacations to tropical resorts multiple times a year. They were living on the edge of their financial means, drowning in the illusion of wealth. Selling my woodworking machinery for scrap metal might have netted them $10,000 or $15,000 in quick cash. That would be just enough to cover the initial deposit for the demolition crew and the architectural plans. But it was nowhere near enough to fund the entire renovation. They were desperately trying to build a new stream of passive income, but they needed a massive influx of capital to finish the project. Where was that money coming from? How were they paying the contractors? The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in my mind, forming a terrifying picture of hidden debt and financial desperation. They had not just stolen my equipment. They were attempting to leverage my property to save themselves from a looming disaster. Monica was a deeply superficial woman, driven entirely by social status and the perception of success. She would never authorize the sale of my tools or the destruction of my shop unless her own lifestyle was in imminent critical danger. Something had gone catastrophically wrong in their finances. Perhaps it was a mountain of hidden credit card debt. Perhaps it was a failed investment or a severe gambling problem. Whatever it was massive, and it was threatening to destroy their perfect public image. I realized then that confronting them about the workshop would only scratch the surface of their betrayal. If I demanded answers now, Monica would simply cry, play the victim, and use her fake pregnancy to deflect the blame. Derek would stand behind her, offering weak apologies while continuing to hide the true extent of their financial ruin. They would promise to fix the workshop, promise to pay me back, and promise that everything was under control. It would be a symphony of lies designed to keep me in the dark while they continued to bleed my estate dry. I could not let that happen. I needed to uncover the absolute truth before I showed my hand. I needed to find the exact financial black hole they were desperately trying to fill. I needed to see their bank statements, their credit reports, and their hidden debts. I needed to know exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with before I stepped onto the battlefield. I took one final photograph of the ruined workshop, capturing the sheer devastation of my life work in a single glaring frame. I lowered my phone, the screen going dark in my hand. I stood in the center of the room, breathing in the cold, dusty air. The transition within me was complete. The confusion, the sorrow, and the paralyzing grief of a betrayed father had been entirely burned away. In their place stood a cold, calculating, and rational man, ready to dismantle the people who had tried to destroy him. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked toward the heavy steel door. I did not look back at the rubble. The workshop was gone, but the war was just beginning. I stepped out into the freezing rain, pulling the door completely shut. I walked over to the broken smart lock resting on the wet concrete. I picked up the heavy metal casing, holding it in my palm for a moment, feeling the cold weight of their deception. I tossed it into the nearby bushes, letting it disappear into the thick blackberry brambles. I moved silently across the muddy lawn, sticking to the deep shadows as I approached my small mother-in-law suite. The main house remained dark and quiet, the occupants completely unaware that their carefully constructed illusion was rapidly coming to an end. I slipped my key into the lock of my suite and stepped inside, locking the door firmly behind me. I stripped off my soaking wet canvas jacket and my muddy boots, leaving them by the entryway. The small suite felt different tonight. It felt like a war room. I walked over to the small kitchen counter and turned on the coffee maker. I needed to stay awake. I needed to plan my next moves with absolute precision. Tomorrow morning the sun would rise and I would walk into the main house, look my son and my daughter-in-law straight in the eyes, and pretend that I believed every single lie they had told me. I would smile. I would nod. I would act like the tired, clueless old man they desperately wanted me to be. But while they smiled back, confident in their victory, I would be quietly reaching out to my most trusted allies. I would hire the best investigators. I would speak to the sharpest attorneys. I would follow the money track, every hidden transaction, and expose the massive rotten core of their financial desperation. I would gather every piece of evidence necessary to completely strip them of their power. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the quiet room. I sat down at my small dining table, opened my phone, and backed up the photographs to a secure, encrypted cloud server. The evidence was safe. The trap was set. They had locked me out of my workshop, thinking they had won. But they had no idea that I was about to lock them out of everything else. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds, casting pale shadows across the manicured lawns. I had not slept a single minute. I sat at my small table watching dawn illuminate the property I spent 40 years maintaining. My mind was sharp, focused entirely on my plan. I washed my face with cold water to erase the fatigue from my eyes and dressed in a simple flannel shirt. It was time to play the tired, oblivious old man. I walked across the damp patio toward the main house. I let myself in through the back door, stepping into the massive kitchen Monica had insisted on remodeling last year. It was a sterile space filled with gleaming white marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, and expensive bowls holding fake fruit. It looked like a photograph from a design magazine devoid of warmth. I moved quietly to the espresso machine Derek had bought and brewed a simple cup of black coffee. The rich aroma filled the cold room. I leaned against the counter holding the warm mug and waited. A few minutes past 7, I heard the heavy footsteps of my son coming down the oak staircase. Derek appeared in the kitchen archway, dressed in his expensive, tailored suit, loosening his silk tie. He looked exhausted. Dark circles hung heavily beneath his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing by the kitchen island. A flash of panic crossed his face before he forced a tight, artificial smile. He cleared his throat nervously, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice slightly higher than usual. "You are up early today. Did you sleep well?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift his weight. "I slept perfectly fine, son," I replied. keeping my voice gentle and even. The rain was a bit loud, but it was nice to be back in my own bed after the drive from Oregon. I poured another cup of coffee and slid it across the marble counter toward him. I thought you could use this. You look a little tired this morning. Is the pressure at the firm getting to you? Derek took the mug with trembling fingers. He avoided my gaze entirely, staring down at the dark liquid as if it held the answers to a test he had not studied for. No, work is fine, he mumbled. Just a lot of meetings lately. You know how it is. I nodded slowly, taking another sip of my coffee. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the counter, and adopted a completely casual tone. So I saw the new lock on the workshop last night. Monica came out and told me you two are doing some remodeling. She said something about needing a toxin-free space for the baby. Derek flinched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I caught it. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the coffee mug. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He still refused to look me in the eye. Yeah, that is right, he stammered, his voice lacking any real conviction. We wanted to surprise you, actually. We know how much you love that shop, but Monica read articles about how airborne particulates and chemical stains can be dangerous for fetal development. We just want to be careful, you know. First-time parents and all that. We have to take every precaution to ensure the environment is perfectly safe. I watched him parrot the exact phrases Monica had clearly rehearsed with him. He sounded like a hostage reading from a script. There was no authority in his voice, no pride of ownership over the decision. He was merely a vessel for his wife's manipulations. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, projecting only mild curiosity. I understand wanting to protect the baby, Derek. That makes perfect sense to me. But a nursery inside a detached steel building in the backyard seems a bit impractical, does it not? What about the 3 empty guest bedrooms upstairs? Are those not suitable for a crib? Derek took a hasty gulp of his scalding hot coffee, wincing slightly as it burned his throat. Well, the thing is, Dad, it is not just going to be a nursery. We have been looking at our long-term financial planning, and Monica had this brilliant idea about generating passive income. We are converting the space into a high-end rental unit, an Airbnb specifically. With the baby coming, we want to make sure we are maximizing the earning potential of the estate. It is an investment in the future of your grandchild. He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, hoping I would buy the lie. It was a pathetic display of cowardice. My son, a man approaching 40 years of age, making a 6-figure salary at a corporate firm, was standing in his own kitchen, visibly shaking, because he could not bear the weight of his own deception. He was terrified of me, but he was clearly far more terrified of Monica. She held the leash, and she pulled it with absolute authority. Passive income. I repeated softly, tasting the bitter irony of the words. So you are building a rental unit. That sounds like a massive undertaking, son. Demolition, plumbing, electrical work, drywall. That requires a significant amount of capital. I had no idea you and Monica were sitting on that kind of cash. It is very impressive that you managed to save up for such a large commercial project while maintaining your current lifestyle. Derek shifted his weight again, his eyes darting toward the hallway, as if checking to see if his wife was coming to rescue him. We have been budgeting very carefully, he lied, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a nervous rush. We secured some excellent financing options, and selling the old machinery gave us a great head start on the contractor deposits. Monica found a buyer who was willing to take it all off our hands quickly, so we did not have to deal with the hassle of moving it. It all just fell into place perfectly. I stared at him, letting the magnitude of his cowardice wash over me. Selling the old machinery. He spoke about my life's work, the tools I had used to put food on his plate when he was a child, as if it were a pile of useless garbage taking up space in the garage. He completely detached himself from the emotional and financial devastation of what they had done. He was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince Mitafam. You know, Dad, Derek continued, his voice taking on a sudden, sickeningly patronizing tone. You have worked so hard your entire life. You built this estate, you provided for Mom, you provided for me. But you are 70 years old now. You should not be out there breathing in sawdust and lifting heavy timber. Your joints ache in the winter, and your back is always bothering you. It is time for you to just rest. You should enjoy your retirement. Take up a quiet hobby, go fishing, read some books. Let me and Monica carry the heavy burdens now. We are just trying to take care of you. We are trying to make sure you do not work yourself into an early grave. The audacity of his words nearly broke my composure. He was standing there actively participating in the theft and destruction of my property and twisting the narrative to frame himself as a caring, protective son. He was trying to gaslight me into believing that gutting my sanctuary was an act of profound familial love. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and it had Monica's fingerprints all over it. She had trained him perfectly. She had taught him how to use my age as a weapon, how to frame my passion as a health hazard, and how to present their overwhelming greed as a noble sacrifice. I looked deeply into his eyes, searching for any trace of the boy I had raised. But that man was completely gone. The shell standing in front of me was hollowed out by a desperate need to please a woman who viewed him only as an instrument to access my wealth. You are right, Derek, I said, allowing a tired sigh to escape my lips. I let my shoulders slump, leaning heavily against the counter to sell the performance. I am getting old. Maybe standing over a table saw for 10 hours a day is not the best idea anymore. I suppose I really should be grateful that you and Monica are looking out for my declining health. Derek exhaled loudly, a massive breath of relief escaping his lungs. He genuinely believed that he had finally won. Before Monica could even step fully into the room, the sharp clicking of her designer heels echoed against the hardwood floor of the hallway. She glided into the kitchen looking like a flawless porcelain doll dressed in premium activewear that she had likely never sweated in. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, immaculate ponytail, and her face was carefully painted to project an aura of effortless maternal glow. She stepped up beside my son, slipping her arm through his and resting her perfectly manicured hand on his chest. It was a highly calculated gesture of possession, a silent way of showing me exactly who controlled the narrative in this house. "Good morning, Bill," she chirped, her voice dripping with that sickening, sugary sweetness she always used when she was preparing to deliver an insult. "I heard you and Derek talking from the top of the stairs. I am so relieved that you are being so understanding about the workshop. We really hated to surprise you like this, but we knew that if we asked, you would just try to talk us out of it. You are so attached to your little hobbies. But we have to put the future of this family first. A baby changes everything, and we just could not risk having toxic dust floating around the property." Her use of the phrase, "little hobbies," felt like a razor blade scraping against my ribs. I kept my expression entirely neutral, offering her the same tired, defeated nod I had just given my son. "I appreciate your concern for my health, Monica," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. Derek was just explaining the financial strategy behind the remodel. An income-generating rental unit is a very ambitious project. I imagine the demolition and plumbing work alone must be quite expensive. I am just surprised you two had the capital to move so quickly. Monica waved her hand dismissively, flashing a bright, dismissive smile. "Oh, we have everything perfectly budgeted, Bill. We are very smart with our investments. And honestly, we were able to fund the entire initial phase by clearing out the yard. You really should be thanking me. I saved you the trouble of dealing with all that heavy, rusty junk in the shop." I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. The ceramic made a sharp clink in the quiet kitchen. Rusty junk. I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air between us. Derek shifted his weight, uncomfortably pulling his arm away from his wife and taking a sudden interest in the digital display of the espresso machine. "Yes, all those old metal machines," Monica continued, completely oblivious to the sudden tension radiating from her husband. "They were taking up so much valuable square footage, and they were completely covered in dirt." I found a local scrap metal dealer who was willing to bring a flatbed truck and haul it all away the very next day. They weighed it all out and gave us $10,000 in cash on the spot. I took that money and handed it straight over to the plumbing contractor to secure our demolition deposit. It was incredibly efficient. We practically got the foundation work done for free. She looked me dead in the eye, waiting for my praise. She genuinely expected me to be grateful that she had violently liquidated my life work. I stared back at her, feeling a cold, dark abyss open up inside my chest. $10,000. I let the number echo through my mind. The industrial cabinet saw alone was worth $7,000. The commercial edge sander was easily worth $12,000. My custom-built lathe, the one I had used to carve Patty's rocking chair, was a precision instrument valued at nearly $15,000. Between the heavy machinery, the specialized hand tools, the exotic wood inventory, and the industrial dust collection system, my workshop contained no less than $300,000 in pristine, meticulously maintained equipment. She had sold $300,000 of precision engineering to a scrap dealer for $10,000. This was not merely ignorance. This was not just the foolish mistake of a woman who did not understand the value of specialized tools. This was an act of blinding, chaotic desperation. No rational human being liquidates heavy commercial machinery for 3% of its actual value unless they are in a state of absolute panic. Moving thousands of pounds of cast iron and steel requires a massive logistical effort. It requires heavy-duty rigging, specialized transport, and a coordinated crew of strong workers. To organize that kind of extraction overnight, they had to take the very first desperate cash offer that came their way. They could not wait a week to list the items online. They could not wait for a proper appraisal. They needed cash, and they needed it the exact minute my truck pulled out of the driveway to go to Oregon. The logical disconnect hit me with the force of a freight train. My mind raced, analyzing the terrifying financial implications of her admission. Derek was a senior executive. He earned a high, six-figure corporate salary. He received annual performance bonuses. They lived in an upscale neighborhood, drove expensive European luxury cars, and dined at the finest restaurants in the city. A couple with that level of income should never find themselves in a position where they need to illegally cannibalize a relative's property just to scrape together a $10,000 contractor deposit. $10,000 should have been nothing but a minor blip in their checking account. Why did they need that tiny amount of cash so urgently? Why the frenzied rush to gut the building and lay down commercial plumbing before I even returned from my trip? It made absolutely no sense. Unless, of course, their entire lifestyle was a complete and total illusion. The truth began to crystallize in my mind, cold and sharp. Derek and Monica were not merely living paycheck to paycheck. They were drowning in a deep, hidden financial hemorrhage. They were completely broke. Their bank accounts had to be drained, their credit cards maxed out, and their available cash non-existent. To orchestrate the overnight theft and fire sale of my workshop for a mere $10,000 proved that they were suffocating under the weight of a massive undisclosed debt. They were building the rental unit not as a smart investment for the baby, but as a frantic attempt to generate immediate cash flow to cover up whatever financial catastrophe was about to consume them completely. Monica tilted her head, her fake smile faltering slightly as the silence in the kitchen stretched on. "Bill," she prompted, her tone turning slightly defensive. "I know you liked playing out there, but you have to admit, $10,000 is a great return for a bunch of old metal. We put it to good use." I looked at the woman who had systematically dismantled my sanctuary. I looked at the son who had allowed her to do it. The rage inside me was a towering, burning inferno, but I locked it away behind a heavy iron door in my mind. I could not let them see the flames. If I confronted them about the true value of the equipment, if I exposed their desperate lie, they would instantly realize that I was onto them. They would know that I saw straight through their pathetic facade, and they would immediately begin covering their tracks. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to feel victorious. "You know, Monica," I finally said, forcing a soft, self-deprecating chuckle to escape my lips, "you are probably right." I reached up and rubbed the back of my neck, playing the role of the defeated, exhausted elder. I have not checked the market value on those old machines in years. They were gathering dust, and they certainly were taking up a lot of space. If you were able to use that money to help get the foundation poured for the new project, then I suppose it was for the best. You two are building a future for your family, and I should not stand in the way of that. I am just a tired old man who needs to learn when to let go of the past. The tension in the kitchen evaporated instantly. Monica let out a bright, triumphant laugh, her shoulders dropping in visible relief. She stepped forward and placed her hand patronizingly on my arm. "Oh, Bill, I knew you would understand once you thought about it logically. You are being so reasonable. And do not worry, once the rental unit is finished and generating income, we will make sure you are taken care of. We want you to enjoy your golden years without any stress." Derek offered a weak, grateful nod, entirely convinced that the crisis had been successfully averted. "Thanks, Dad. That really means a lot to us. It really does." I offered them both one last, tired smile. I picked up my empty coffee mug and placed it carefully into the stainless steel sink. I turned away from them, walking slowly toward the hallway. Well, I think I'm going to head back to my suite and get some rest. The drive really took it out of me. You two have a wonderful day. I walked out of the kitchen, my footsteps slow and heavy on the hardwood floor. I listened to the sound of Monica happily humming a tune behind me. She actually believed she had won. She actually believed she had successfully liquidated my life work and manipulated me into thanking her for it. But as soon as I crossed the threshold into the privacy of my own suite, my posture straightened. The facade of the broken old man vanished completely. I locked the door securely behind me and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. The pieces of the puzzle had been laid out in front of me, and the picture they formed was one of extreme criminal desperation. Selling my machinery for scrap was the fatal mistake that exposed their vulnerability. It proved they were frantic, and frantic people leave a massive trail of mistakes behind them. I was going to follow that trail. I was going to find out exactly where all of Derek's corporate salary was going, and I was going to uncover the massive financial black hole Monica was trying to hide. I unlocked my phone screen and opened my contacts. It was time to start digging deeply into their private lives. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hook by the door, and stepped back out into the biting Washington morning. I could not make these calls from inside the suite. Monica had a habit of quietly appearing in hallways and listening through thin walls. I needed absolute privacy. I pulled the collar of my coat up against the freezing dampness and began to walk. The estate was massive, bordered by a dense line of towering evergreen trees that shielded the property from the main road. I followed the gravel path that wound around the perimeter, my boots crunching rhythmically against the wet stones. The cold air stung my cheeks, but the physical discomfort was exactly what I needed to keep my mind perfectly sharp. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Thomas Griffin. Tom and I went back more than 30 years. He was a retired detective from the Seattle Police Department who had spent the last 2 decades running a highly successful private investigation firm specializing in corporate fraud and hidden assets. I had restored a priceless antique grandfather clock for his wife many years ago, and we had remained close ever since. If anyone could find a financial black hole, it was Tom. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone echo in the crisp morning air. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gruff and thick with sleep. "Bill, you old woodchuck. Do you have any idea what time it is?" he grumbled, though I could hear the underlying warmth in his tone. "It is past 8 in the morning, Tom." "You are getting soft in your old age," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I am sorry to wake you, but I need your help, professionally, and I need it to be completely off the books." The playful exhaustion vanished from his voice instantly. The seasoned investigator took over. "What is going on, Bill? You sound like you're standing on the edge of a cliff." I stopped walking, turning to look back through the trees at the roofline of my estate. My son and his wife just liquidated $300,000 worth of my commercial woodworking machinery. They sold it to a scrap metal dealer for $10,000 in cash while I was out of town. They used the money to pay a deposit on a commercial plumbing crew to illegally convert my workshop into an income property. Tom let out a low, sharp whistle. 300 grand for 10. That is not just a bad business decision, Bill. That is a panicked fire sale. Someone is bleeding out. Exactly, I said, my voice hardening. Derek makes a very comfortable six-figure salary as a corporate executive. They have no business scraping the bottom of the barrel for 10 grand. Something is horribly wrong with their finances. They are covering up a massive deficit, and I need to know exactly what it is before I confront them. You want a full shadow audit? Tom stated, his tone completely serious. I can pull their credit reports check for secondary mortgages, outstanding personal loans, and any offshore or hidden accounts. If they are gambling, if they are buried in luxury debt, or if they got taken in some kind of scam, I will find the paper trail. I need you to dig as deep as you legally can, Tom. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know where every single penny of his salary has gone for the past 3 years. I want to know her spending habits. I want to know if they owe money to the government, to private lenders, or to anyone else. And most importantly, they cannot know they are being investigated. If she even sniffs that someone is looking into her accounts, she will start shredding documents and burning hard drives. Do not worry about the ghosting, Bill. I will run the inquiries through proxy servers. It will not even trigger a soft pull on their credit monitors. Give me 48 hours. I will have a dossier so thick it will make your head spin. But Bill, you need to prepare yourself. When people do something this desperate, the truth at the bottom of the well is usually incredibly ugly. I am already standing in the ugly, Tom. Just get me the numbers. I ended the call and slipped the phone away for a moment, letting out a long, heavy breath. A thick white mist was beginning to roll off the nearby lake, wrapping the trunks of the evergreen trees in a damp, ghostly shroud. I watched a pair of crows circle overhead, their harsh caws piercing the quiet morning. For a brief second, a wave of profound sorrow threatened to wash over me again. I was actively hiring a private investigator to audit my own son. I was treating my flesh and blood like a hostile corporate takeover target. It went against every single paternal instinct I had ever possessed. But my paternal instincts were exactly what had blinded me in the first place. I had to treat this as a war because they had already fired the first shot. I pulled my phone back out. There was one more call I needed to make. I scrolled down to the letter R and tapped the name Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was my estate attorney. She was a brilliant, fiercely intelligent woman in her late 50s who ran a boutique law firm in downtown Seattle. She was sharp, meticulous, and absolutely ruthless in a courtroom. She had helped Patty and me draft our wills decades ago, and she had managed the establishment of my trust after Patty passed away. Evelyn knew the legal framework of my life better than anyone else on the planet. Her assistant transferred me immediately, and Evelyn picked up the line with her usual crisp efficiency. William. Good morning. I was not expecting to hear from you until our annual review next month. How was the timber run in Oregon? The timber was beautiful, Evelyn. Coming home was not... I said, my tone completely devoid of pleasantries. I need to see you in your office. Today, as soon as you can fit me into your schedule. The rapid clicking of the keyboard stopped on her end of the line. I have a sudden opening at 11 o'clock this morning. What is the emergency, Bill? You do not sound like yourself. I began to pace back down the gravel path, my boots kicking up small stones. Derek and his wife have initiated a massive unpermitted commercial renovation on my property without my consent. They destroyed my workshop. But that is not what I am calling you about. I have reason to believe they are in severe financial distress, and I need to review every single legal document regarding this estate. The estate is in a secure trust, Bill. You are the sole trustee, Evelyn said, her voice remaining calm and professional. They cannot simply sell the property out from under you. I know they cannot sell the house, I replied, the frustration bleeding into my words. but I need to know if there are any loopholes, any vulnerabilities they could exploit. 3 years ago, when I had my heart bypass surgery, I signed a medical power of attorney over to Derek. I need to make absolutely certain that the document was strictly limited to healthcare decisions. I need to know that he cannot leverage my assets, that he cannot take out loans against the property, and that my financial walls are completely impenetrable. There was a brief silence on the line. I could hear the faint rustling of paper as Evelyn processed my request. A standard medical power of attorney does not grant financial authority, Bill. However, if you are concerned about forgery or unauthorized access, we need to do a comprehensive sweep of your titles, your deeds, and your credit history immediately. I will pull the current property records from the county clerk before you arrive. We will review the exact legal standing of your estate, down to the last comma. Thank you, Evelyn. I will be at your office at 11. Bill, she said softly, her professional armor cracking just a fraction to reveal the genuine friend beneath. Whatever is happening, we will handle it. No one is going to take what belongs to you. I thanked her again and ended the call. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I slid it back into my coat pocket. The wheels were now officially in motion. I had just unleashed two brilliant, relentless professionals onto my son and daughter-in-law. Tom would tear through the shadows of their financial lives, exposing every hidden debt and maxed-out credit card. Evelyn would build an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets, ensuring that they could not steal another single dime from my estate. The immense destructive machinery of accountability had been activated, and there was absolutely no way to turn it back off. I reached the end of the gravel path and turned back toward the main house. The pale morning sun was finally beginning to break through the thick gray clouds, casting long, sharp beams of light across the manicured lawns. The house stood tall and imposing, a beautiful, sprawling structure that I had bought and paid for with decades of sweat and sacrifice. I had offered it to them out of pure, unconditional love. I had wanted to give them a safe harbor to build a family. But as I stared at the large bay windows of the master bedroom, I felt absolutely no warmth. The house no longer looked like a family home. It looked like a parasite, a bloated, greedy organism that was slowly trying to consume me. They were inside those walls right now, probably sipping their expensive espresso, completely convinced that their manipulative lies had worked. They thought the old man had simply surrendered to his fatigue. They thought they had successfully paved over my legacy to build their passive income empire. I let out a slow, deliberate breath, watching the condensation plume in the freezing air. I was going to let them keep believing that. I was going to let them hire their contractors. I was going to let them order their expensive plumbing fixtures and their high-end yoga mats. I was going to let them dig their financial grave so deep that they would never be able to climb out. And then, when they were at their most vulnerable, when they thought their victory was absolutely assured, I was going to drop the hammer. I adjusted the collar of my heavy coat and began the walk back to my suite. I needed to change into a suit for my meeting with Evelyn in downtown Seattle. The grieving, confused father who had driven up from Oregon yesterday was dead and gone. In his place was a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. I had spent my entire life measuring twice and cutting once. It was time to start cutting. The drive into downtown Seattle was a blur of gray skies and endless morning traffic. I navigated my old pickup truck through the crowded streets, pulling into the dark underground parking garage of the high-rise building where Evelyn Reed kept her law firm. The transition from the quiet, damp isolation of my Bellevue estate to the clinical glass and steel efficiency of the city felt jarring, but it matched the cold calculation taking over my mind. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor, stepping out into a reception area decorated in dark mahogany and polished brass. Evelyn's assistant, a sharply dressed young man, greeted me with a polite nod and immediately escorted me down the long, carpeted hallway. He did not offer me coffee or make small talk. The atmosphere in the office was already thick with an unspoken, heavy tension. I stepped through the heavy double doors of Evelyn's private office. The room was expansive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the Puget Sound. Usually coming into this room felt like visiting an old trusted friend. Evelyn and I would spend the first 10 minutes asking about each other's families and reminiscing about the old days when Patty was still alive. Today, however, the environment was entirely different. Evelyn was already seated behind her massive desk. She was wearing a sharp, dark, tailored suit, and her hands were clasped tightly together over a thick manila folder. There was no warm smile of greeting. There was no offer to sit and catch up. Her expression was completely rigid, her jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. The look in her eyes was one of profound, disturbing gravity. I had known this woman for over 2 decades. I had seen her negotiate million-dollar estate settlements and navigate complex corporate litigation without breaking a sweat. Seeing her look so deeply unsettled sent a sharp, involuntary spike of adrenaline straight through my chest. I closed the doors behind me, the heavy wood shutting out the ambient noise of the law firm. I walked over to the leather client chairs positioned across from her desk and sat down slowly. The silence in the room was suffocating. I placed my hands on the armrests, bracing myself for whatever she was about to tell me. Evelyn let out a long, measured breath. She unclasped her hands and opened the manila folder, spreading a series of official-looking documents across the polished surface of her desk. She did not waste any time with pleasantries. She looked me directly in the eye, her gaze piercing and uncompromising. "Bill," she began, her voice exceptionally low and steady. "When you called me this morning, you asked me to review the legal standing of your estate. You asked me to ensure that your financial walls were completely impenetrable. I pulled the current property records from the county clerk, and I ran an expedited check on your personal credit profile to verify that the trust was functioning exactly as we designed it." I nodded slowly, keeping my face perfectly still. "And what did you find, Evelyn? Are there any vulnerabilities in the trust? Have they found a way to leverage the property?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She picked up a thick stack of papers stapled together at the top left corner. The document bore the official seal of a major national bank. She slid the stack across the desk until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the bold black text printed across the header. "Bill," Evelyn said, her tone carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. "Your financial walls are not impenetrable. In fact, they have been completely breached. The Bellevue estate, the home you and Patty worked your entire lives to pay off, is no longer owned free and clear." I stared at the bank logo on the paperwork, a creeping sense of dread wrapping itself around my throat. I did not touch the document. "What are you talking about, Evelyn? I paid off the final mortgage balance in 1998. I hold the original deed in my safe. I have never borrowed a single dime against that property since the day the bank sent me the release letter." Evelyn pointed a manicured finger at the paperwork resting in front of me. "According to the county records and this active banking file, a massive home equity line of credit was opened against your estate exactly 8 months ago. The document you are looking at is a legally binding loan agreement. The property was appraised, leveraged, and used as collateral to secure a revolving line of credit." I felt all the blood rush away from my face. My ears began to ring with a high, piercing frequency. The words on the page blurred together into a meaningless jumble of legal jargon. A home equity line of credit, a loan against my sanctuary. I forced my eyes to focus on the summary box printed on the first page. I looked for the principal loan amount, expecting to see something terrible, perhaps $50,000, to cover their extravagant shopping habits. But the number printed in the box was so astronomically large that my brain simply refused to process it. The principal amount approved and fully drawn against the equity of my home was $600,000. $600,000. I repeated the number aloud, my voice sounding hollow and entirely unrecognizable to my own ears. I looked up at Evelyn, the shock temporarily paralyzing my ability to think. "This is impossible. This has to be a clerical error, a massive administrative mistake." Evelyn, I have never stepped foot inside that bank. I have never spoken to a loan officer. I have absolutely never signed my name to a document authorizing a $600,000 lien against my property. Evelyn leaned forward, her expression filled with a terrible, sympathetic sorrow. I know you did not sign this bill. I know you would never jeopardize the estate. But the bank believes you did. The county recorder believes you did. The funds were approved. The account was opened, and the entire $600,000 balance was withdrawn in a series of massive wire transfers over the course of 3 weeks. The money is completely gone, and your property is the sole collateral holding up the debt. The ringing in my ears grew louder, drowning out the ambient hum of the city traffic outside the window. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands against my forehead. The sheer magnitude of the theft was almost impossible to comprehend. They had not just stolen my woodworking machinery. They had not just destroyed my workshop to build a rental unit. Those actions were merely the desperate symptoms of a much larger catastrophic disease. They had secretly mortgaged the very land I slept on. They had extracted more than $500,000 of my hard-earned equity, evaporating it into thin air. If this massive loan defaulted, the bank would not care about my legacy or my memories. They would simply seize the estate, auction it off to the highest bidder, and leave me homeless on the street at 70 years of age. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening violence. This was why Monica had ruthlessly liquidated my tools for a fraction of their value. This was why they were frantically tearing up my shop to build an income-generating property behind my back. They were completely buried under a mountain of fraudulent debt. The monthly interest payments on a $600,000 line of credit would be astronomical, far beyond what Derek could cover with his corporate salary, especially while maintaining their lavish lifestyle. They were suffocating, and they needed immediate cash flow just to keep the bank from knocking on the front door. I slowly lowered my hands and opened my eyes. I looked down at the fraudulent loan document, my vision crystal clear. The sorrow and confusion were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. The situation had escalated far beyond simple disrespect or greedy entitlement. This was no longer just a family dispute over a backyard workshop. This was a calculated, highly orchestrated financial crime. My son and my daughter-in-law had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. They had committed a massive federal felony, and they had used my life's work as the collateral for their devastating deception. I looked back up at Evelyn, my jaw set like stone. I needed to know exactly how they had bypassed the legal protections of my trust. I needed to understand the exact mechanism they had used to forge their way into my accounts. And most importantly, I needed to know how to utterly destroy them. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on her desk, ready to start an absolute legal war. How did they do this? Evelyn, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. How did they bypass the trust? How does a bank approve a $600,000 line of credit against a property owned by a secure trust without the primary trustee sitting in the room? Evelyn let out a slow, weary sigh. She reached across the desk and pulled a secondary stack of papers from her thick manila folder. She slid a heavily stapled packet toward me, pointing to the final page. They did not bypass the trust, Bill. They used a back door that we left open for emergencies. They used your son. I looked down at the paper. It was a dense legal document filled with boilerplate clauses and heavy paragraphs outlining the transfer of authority. I did not immediately recognize the specific form, but I recognized the signature at the bottom. It was my signature, or at least an incredibly convincing forgery of it. I looked back up at her, waiting for the explanation. 3 years ago, Evelyn continued, her voice meticulous and steady. You came into this office preparing for a high-risk quadruple bypass heart surgery. You were terrified, and rightfully so. We drafted a comprehensive medical power of attorney. You legally appointed Derek as your healthcare proxy, giving him the absolute authority to make medical decisions on your behalf in the event that you were incapacitated on the operating table or placed into a medically induced coma. I nodded slowly, the memory of that terrifying time washing over me. I remember signing that document. I remember handing it to Derek in the hospital room the night before they cut my chest open. But that was strictly for medical decisions. It gave him the right to talk to doctors, to approve surgical interventions, or to take me off life support. It had absolutely nothing to do with my property or my bank accounts. That is what we drafted. Evelyn agreed, tapping her pen against the fraudulent loan agreement. But that is not the document sitting in front of you. Take a closer look at the second page. I turned the page over, scanning the dense paragraphs. My eyes landed on a section titled General Financial Authority. The text explicitly granted Derek Caldwell the unrestricted legal right to manage real estate, open credit lines, pledge collateral, and execute binding financial contracts on behalf of William Caldwell and the Caldwell Estate Trust. My breath caught in my throat. This is a forgery, I stated, the anger vibrating beneath my words. I never authorized this. I never signed a document granting financial authority. Evelyn nodded in solemn agreement. I know you did not. I pulled the original medical power of attorney from our firm archives this morning to compare them. The first page and the final signature page of this document are identical to the medical proxy we drafted 3 years ago. But the middle pages, the sections detailing the scope of the authority, have been completely swapped out and replaced. They took the legitimate medical document, removed the healthcare provisions, inserted broad financial powers, and then presented the altered packet to the bank as a fully executed original durable power of attorney. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. They had weaponized my own mortality against me. I closed my eyes, letting the crushing weight of the memory drag me back to that sterile hospital room 3 years ago. I remembered sitting on the edge of the stiff hospital bed, wearing a thin paper gown, my heart failing inside my chest. I had been so incredibly frightened that I might never wake up from the anesthesia. Derek had sat in the plastic chair beside my bed, holding my hand. I had looked my son in the eyes, handing him the folder containing the medical proxy, and I had told him that I trusted him with my very life. I had literally handed him the legal power to pull the plug and let me die if the surgery went wrong. I had placed the ultimate burden of my existence onto his shoulders out of pure, unconditional love and absolute faith in his character. And while I lay on an operating table with my chest cracked open, trusting my son to protect my life, he and his wife had taken that sacred document, ripped out its heart, and turned it into a weapon to steal my livelihood. The level of sociopathic detachment required to look at a dying father's medical proxy and see only a financial loophole was utterly monstrous. It was a betrayal so profound, so fundamentally evil, that it defied normal human comprehension. I opened my eyes, staring at the fraudulent paperwork. Derek did not come up with this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Derek is a coward. He is weak and he is selfish, but he does not have the strategic mind to orchestrate a sophisticated legal forgery. He would not even know where to begin altering a legally binding trust document. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a fierce, predatory intelligence. You are absolutely right, Bill. Derek is the name on the document, but Monica is the architect of the crime. I reviewed the metadata on the electronic submission filed with the bank. The altered power of attorney was scanned and submitted from an IP address registered to Monica's personal consulting business. Furthermore, the notary seal stamped on the final page, the seal required to authenticate the forged document, belongs to a woman named Sarah Jenkins. I do not know who that is, I replied, my brow furrowing in confusion. I do, Evelyn countered smoothly. Sarah Jenkins is Monica's former college roommate. She got her notary license 4 years ago. Monica clearly manipulated or paid her friend to illegally stamp the altered document without you being present in the room. They colluded to bypass the bank's security protocols, presenting a perfectly stamped, flawless forgery that gave Derek the absolute legal right to walk into that bank and leverage your home for $600,000 in cash. Monica pulled the strings, Sarah stamped the paper, and Derek walked into the bank to execute the theft. It was a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of their conspiracy wash over me. They had planned this carefully. This was not a crime of sudden passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. They had methodically gathered the necessary pieces, manipulated the legal system, and executed a massive federal felony right under my nose. They had smiled in my face, eaten dinner at my table, and asked about my health, all while secretly knowing they had mortgaged the roof over my head. My hands balled into tight fists, the leather of the armrests creaking under the pressure of my grip. My son had sold his soul to a woman who viewed my existence as nothing more than a resource to be plundered. Evelyn watched me closely, allowing the silence to settle between us, so I could process the devastating reality of the situation. "We have everything we need to destroy them, Bill," she finally said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register. "This is bank fraud, wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and elder financial abuse. If we take this file to the federal authorities right now, they will issue arrest warrants before the end of the week. Monica will face serious federal prison time, and Derek will go down right beside her as a willing accomplice. We can freeze the remaining equity in the home contest, the validity of the loan with the bank's fraud department, and begin the long process of clearing the lien from your title. But I need to know how you want to proceed. Once I file the paperwork, there is no turning back. The federal government does not negotiate family disputes. They prosecute felonies." I looked away from the forged documents, turning my gaze toward the large window overlooking the Seattle skyline. The gray clouds were thick and heavy, threatening another torrential downpour. I thought about the ruined workshop. I thought about my beautiful, expensive machinery sold for pennies to a scrap dealer. I thought about the fake nursery, the lie about the toxic dust, and the repulsive, mocking smile on Monica's face when she told me to enjoy my retirement. They had systematically tried to strip me of my dignity, my passion, and my financial security. They had mistaken my quiet, steady nature for weakness. They had assumed I would simply roll over and accept my fate like a helpless old fool. I turned back to Evelyn, meeting her fierce, unwavering gaze. "We do not go to the authorities yet," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "I need to know exactly where that $600,000 went. If we go to the police right now, Monica will have time to hide the remaining cash. We must track all the stolen money first. We let Tom finish his shadow audit. I want to see the bottom of the financial black hole before I bury them." Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression a mix of professional respect and deep personal sympathy. She agreed to hold the files securely in her vault and prepare the federal fraud packets so they would be ready the exact second I gave the green light. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoned my coat, and walked out of the law firm. I rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage in total silence. The drive back to Bellevue was agonizingly slow. The heavy Washington rain had returned, turning the highway into a miserable gray blur. My mind was racing, calculating every variable, trying to anticipate whatever desperate move Monica and Derek might try next. I knew I had to maintain the facade of the clueless old man for just a little while longer. I had to go back to the estate walk past the destroyed workshop and smile at the very people who had secretly mortgaged my entire life. I parked my truck near the mother-in-law suite, deliberately avoiding the main house. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the window watching the rain hammer against the glass. I waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I made a pot of black coffee and drank it until my stomach turned sour. At exactly 4 p.m, my cell phone finally vibrated on the table, the screen illuminated with the name Thomas Griffin. I snatched the phone and brought it to my ear, skipping any form of greeting. "Tell me you found the bottom of the hole, Tom," I said, my voice tight with anticipation. I heard a heavy, exhausted sigh on the other end of the line. "I found the bottom, Bill," Tom replied, his gravelly voice sounding older and more tired than I had ever heard it. "And I am telling you right now, it is not just a hole. It is a complete financial crater. I have been tracking money for 30 years, and the sheer stupidity of what your daughter-in-law did actually made me sit back in my chair and stare at the wall." I pulled a legal pad and a pen toward me, ready to take notes. "Walk me through the numbers, Tom. Where did the $600,000 go? Is any of it still sitting in a liquid account? Can we recover the cash?" I heard the shuffling of papers on his end. "None of it is liquid, Bill. The entire $600,000 is completely, unequivocally gone. It vanished into thin air." He paused, letting the finality of the statement sink in. "According to the wire transfer logs I managed to pull the day after the bank approved the home equity line of credit, Derek transferred the entire balance into a secondary checking account, solely controlled by Monica. From there, Monica broke the funds down into smaller structured wires to avoid triggering immediate federal flags. Over the course of 3 weeks, she funneled every single penny into a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange operating out of a server in the Bahamas." I tightened my grip on the pen. "Cryptocurrency. They mortgaged my estate to gamble on digital coins." "It gets worse." Bill Tom continued, his tone turning sharply professional. "She did not just buy Bitcoin or some established asset. She dumped the entire 600 grand into a proprietary token, an initial coin offering for a brand new decentralized finance platform. The platform promised investors a guaranteed monthly return of 20% on their staked assets. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme dressed up in modern technological buzzwords. I closed my eyes, rubbing the bridge of my nose. 20% guaranteed returns. Anyone with a fraction of a functioning brain knows that is mathematically impossible. Why would Monica, a woman who is supposedly obsessed with status and financial security, risk over $500,000 of stolen money on an obvious internet scam? Because she was not buying it from a stranger. Tom revealed, dropping the ultimate bombshell. I dug into the corporate filings for the offshore LLC that launched the coin. They use proxy directors to hide the true owners, but I followed the server registration payments back to a bank account in Florida. The architect of the entire cryptocurrency platform, the man running the scam, is a guy named Julian. My eyes snapped open. I knew that name. Julian was Monica's older brother. He was a smooth-talking, charismatic drifter who was always pitching a new revolutionary business idea at family gatherings. He was a grifter, plain and simple. I had warned Derek about him years ago. She gave the money to Julian. I whispered, the sickening reality of the betrayal hitting me all over again. She mortgaged my home to fund her brother's criminal enterprise. Exactly, Tom confirmed. Julian convinced her that his new coin was going to revolutionize the financial sector. He probably promised her that if she provided the initial liquidity to float the project, she would triple her money in 6 months. She saw a chance to become an instant multimillionaire without doing a single day of actual work. She stole your equity, handed it to her brother, and waited for the massive returns to roll in. But Julian is a con artist. 2 months ago, the inevitable happened. He executed what they call a rug pull in the crypto world. He liquidated the entire central liquidity pool, transferred the untraceable funds to cold storage wallets, and completely vanished. The value of the coin dropped to absolute zero overnight. The platform was deleted. The money is gone, and Julian is likely sitting on a beach in a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. I dropped the pen onto the table. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor, but I did not bother to pick it up. Monica had not just made a bad investment. She had willingly handed $600,000 of my life savings to a professional thief, blinding herself with pure, unadulterated greed. And when her brother betrayed her when he stole the money and fled, he left her holding the bag for a massive federal bank loan secured entirely by my property. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with perfect, terrifying clarity. The desperation, the frantic, unhinged behavior, the sheer panic. Everything finally made absolute sense. I leaned forward, staring blankly at the wall as I spoke into the phone. The workshop, Tom. This is why they tore down my workshop. They are completely broke, and the bank is demanding monthly payments on the loan. Tom let out a heavy sigh of agreement. The monthly interest alone on a $600,000 high-yield credit line is staggering, Bill. Derek's corporate salary is entirely consumed by their lifestyle. Their luxury cars, their designer clothes, their expensive dinners. They live paycheck to paycheck, trying to maintain the illusion of wealth. When Julian stole the principal loan funds, they were left with a massive monthly liability that they literally cannot afford to pay. If they miss those interest payments, the bank will immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on your estate. They are backed into a corner, completely terrified. I felt a cold, dark smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy, but a grim recognition of their absolute stupidity, so they decided to build a luxury rental unit. They figured if they could rapidly convert my workshop into an income-generating property, they could use the rental cash flow to secretly pay the monthly interest on the stolen loan. They thought they could keep the plates spinning just long enough to figure out a permanent solution, all without me ever discovering the forgery. That is the plan, Tom confirmed. But building a high-end rental unit requires capital they do not possess. They have zero liquid cash. Their credit cards are completely maxed out. No legitimate bank will lend them another dime because their debt-to-income ratio is astronomical. They have absolutely no way to pay the contractors for the demolition or the plumbing work. I finished the thought for him, my voice dripping with cold realization. So she liquidated my woodworking machinery. She sold $300,000 of professional equipment to a scrap metal dealer for $10,000 just to get the cash needed to pour the concrete and start the plumbing. They are cannibalizing my entire life to hide a massive federal crime. Tom was silent for a moment before responding softly. Yes, Bill. That is exactly what they are doing. They are desperate, and desperate people are incredibly dangerous. You need to be careful. I ended the call. The mystery was solved. The war had officially begun. I stood up from the table, feeling the incredible weight of the truth settle deep into my bones. The shadow audit was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. I looked out the window at the dark estate. They had no idea what was coming. The sun had barely crested the horizon the following morning when I found myself driving back down the rain-slicked highway toward downtown Seattle. The conversation with Tom the previous evening had provided the missing pieces of the puzzle, but I knew the legal implications of his discoveries needed to be formalized. I needed to sit across from Evelyn and align the financial devastation Tom had uncovered with the legal reality of my estate. The heavy clouds hung low over the skyline, mirroring the dark, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I navigated the familiar route to her high-rise office building, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel of my truck with a quiet, rigid determination. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor. Evelyn was waiting for me. Her assistant ushered me straight through the heavy mahogany doors into her private office. She did not look like a woman who had slept. Dark circles shadowed her sharp eyes, and her desk was covered in a fresh layer of thick, densely printed files. She motioned for me to sit in the leather chair across from her. I sat down, my posture straight and braced for impact. Evelyn folded her hands over a sealed, certified envelope resting in the center of her desk. She looked at me with an expression of profound, unyielding gravity. She explained that after our meeting yesterday, she had pulled a deeper, more aggressive sweep of the public property records and the associated banking communications tied to the forged home equity line of credit. Because she was the registered attorney of record for the trust, she had the legal authority to request direct status updates from the financial institution holding the debt. She picked up the thick envelope and slid it slowly across the polished wood toward me. She took a deep breath and told me that this was the final, most terrifying piece of paper I would ever have to read regarding my estate. I could see her hands trembling just slightly. I looked down at the thick envelope. The return address belonged to the Commercial Lending Division of the National Bank. My fingers felt numb as I opened the flap and pulled out the stiff, heavy pages. The document was a formal, legally binding preliminary notice of default. I read the bold black text at the top of the page. It stated that the monthly interest payments on the $600,000 balance had been completely missed for the past 2 consecutive billing cycles. The account was now severely delinquent. The bank was formally declaring its intent to protect its collateral. Evelyn watched my eyes scan the page, her voice quiet but razor-sharp as she narrated the reality of the document. She explained that the bank was not interested in excuses. They were not interested in the fact that the loan was a forgery. As far as their automated systems were concerned, a massive debt was defaulting. The paper explicitly stated that if the account was not brought completely current, including all late fees and penalty charges, the bank would formally initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Bellevue estate in exactly 60 days. 60 days. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. In exactly 2 months, the bank would file the paperwork to seize the land I had bought decades ago. They would auction off the home Patty and I had built, the soil where we had planted our trees, the very foundation of my life. I stared at the paper, feeling a cold, hollow terror briefly threaten to overtake my composure. They were going to take everything from me. I looked up at Evelyn, my breathing shallow but controlled. I placed the notice of default back onto her desk and smoothed out the edges with the palm of my hand. I told her that I knew exactly why the payments had been missed. I recounted the entire conversation I had with Tom the previous evening. I explained the offshore cryptocurrency scheme, the guaranteed 20% returns, and the catastrophic betrayal by her own brother, Julian. I laid out the stark, undeniable truth. The entire $600,000 had been stolen in a rug pull scam. Monica and Derek had absolutely zero liquidity remaining. They were completely and utterly broke, drowning under the weight of a massive federal loan they could not even begin to service. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her eyes widening in disbelief as she processed the sheer blinding stupidity of their actions. She shook her head, stating that leveraging a primary residence to gamble on unregulated digital tokens was the financial equivalent of setting yourself on fire. But then her expression sharpened. She looked down at the default notice, then back up at me. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating precision. I told Evelyn to connect the dots. I explained that this ticking 60-day clock was the exact reason why my workshop had been violently gutted. Monica was not building an Airbnb rental out of a desire for simple passive income. She was building it out of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew the bank was preparing to seize the estate. She knew that if the property went into foreclosure, the forgery would immediately be discovered, the authorities would be involved, and she would spend the next decade in federal prison. Her only way out was to generate a massive, immediate stream of cash to cover the monthly interest payments and hide her crime from the bank. She believed that a luxury rental unit on a sprawling Bellevue estate could easily command several $100s a night. If she could maintain a high occupancy rate, she could scrape together just enough cash flow to keep the bank satisfied and keep me entirely in the dark. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. She pointed out the absolute pathetic delusion of her strategy. She explained that completing a commercial renovation, passing county plumbing and electrical inspections, securing the proper short-term rental permits, and establishing a profitable listing took months of dedicated effort. Monica believed she could bypass all the legal regulations, slap some expensive finishes onto a gutted workshop, and start collecting luxury rental income in under 60 days. It was the frantic, illogical thinking of a desperate criminal backed completely into a corner. Evelyn asked me how I wanted to proceed. She reminded me that we had the evidence to go to the federal authorities immediately. We could hand over the forged power of attorney, the cryptocurrency wire transfers, and the default notice to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They would arrest Monica and Derek for bank fraud before the week was over. The bank would freeze the foreclosure process pending a criminal investigation, and my estate would be safe. I told Evelyn we would not go to the authorities just yet. I wanted them to build their hopes up, to sink their remaining resources into that ruined workshop. At the last possible second, I was going to tear their world apart. Evelyn smiled coldly. She told me she would prepare the fraud packets to file on very short notice. She would quietly flag the account with an internal bank fraud department. We would build a legal cage around them. I thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I folded the notice of default and slipped it into my coat. That piece of paper was not a death sentence. It was the exact weapon I was going to use. I left the office. The drive back to Bellevue felt entirely different than the drive into the city. The rain had stopped and a fierce biting wind was sweeping the clouds away. I arrived back at the estate and parked my truck. I walked across the damp lawn, stopping to look at the gutted shell of my former workshop. I could hear the faint sounds of a construction crew inside, the harsh grinding of drills and the banging of hammers. They were working frantically, racing against the 60-day clock ticking down in the background. I stood there listening to them destroy my sanctuary, and I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I only felt a cold, patient anticipation. I would let them finish their work. I would let Monica spend her days stressing over paint colors and soaking tubs. I was going to let Derek lie awake at night sweating over the mounting contractor bills. I was going to let them exhaust every single option they had left in this world. And when the time was perfectly right, I was going to show them exactly what happens when you mistake a quiet, hard-working man for a clueless, defenseless fool. The 60-day countdown had officially begun, but I was the one holding the detonator. They were completely and utterly unaware of the absolute destruction that was coming for them very soon. I walked away from the gutted workshop, my boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp grass. The knowledge of their impending financial ruin was a powerful weapon, but I needed to know exactly how they planned to execute their final desperate moves. I needed to hear the unfiltered truth directly from their own mouths when they thought no one else was listening. I got back into my truck and drove away from the estate, heading toward a specialized electronics store I had found on the outskirts of the city. The store was a quiet, unassuming place that sold professional surveillance equipment to private investigators and security firms. I walked through the aisles, bypassing the standard cameras and home alarms, and approached the counter. I asked the clerk for a micro-voice-activated audio recorder with a live transmission feed. He handed me a small flat device no larger than a matchbox. It was entirely black, coated in a stealth matte finish, and equipped with a highly sensitive multi-directional microphone capable of picking up a whisper from across a large room. It ran on a long-lasting lithium battery and broadcasted a secure encrypted audio stream directly to a paired smartphone application. I paid for the device in cash, wanting absolutely no electronic trail attached to the purchase. Driving back into the estate, the small black box sat on the passenger seat, a silent testament to how drastically my life had changed. I was a craftsman, a man who built beautiful things with honest labor. Now I was buying espionage equipment to spy on my own flesh and blood. But the guilt that might have plagued me a month ago was entirely absent. They had drawn the battle lines when they forged my signature on a federal bank loan. I was simply adapting to the rules of the war they had started. I pulled back into the driveway as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows over the property. I waited until early evening to make my move. I knew Derek and Monica had a strict routine. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Monica would take a long, luxurious bath in the master suite, while Derek would lock himself in his home office to drink heavily and pretend to work. The main floor of the house would be completely abandoned for at least 45 minutes. I walked across the patio, moving with quiet, deliberate steps. I unlocked the back door and stepped into the massive kitchen, the silence of the house pressing heavily against my ears. The ambient scent of expensive truffle oil and roasted garlic lingered in the air from whatever lavish meal they had prepared, a stark contrast to the financial ruin looming over their heads. I moved silently through the kitchen and into the formal dining room. In the center of the room sat a massive custom-built mahogany dining table. I traced the intricate grain of the mahogany wood, remembering the pride I felt when I gifted it to them, oblivious to the fact that it would eventually become a tool for my own survival. I knelt on the expensive Persian rug and slid my upper body beneath the heavy tabletop. I pulled the micro-recorder from my pocket and peeled the backing off the industrial-grade adhesive strip. I pressed the small black box firmly against the underside of the table, hiding it directly beneath the center support beam, where it was completely invisible from any angle. I held my hand against it for 10 long seconds, ensuring the bond was absolute. I activated the device with a quiet click. A tiny green light flashed once, indicating that the live feed was successfully paired with my phone, and then went completely dark. I slid out from under the table, brushed off my knees, and walked back out the kitchen door without making a single sound. I retreated to the safety of my mother-in-law suite, locked the heavy deadbolt, and turned off all the lights. I wanted them to look out their window and see my suite completely dark, leading them to believe that the tired old man had simply gone to sleep early. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the only light coming from the glowing screen of my smartphone resting on the coffee table. My joints ached from the damp cold creeping through the floorboards, but I refused to move. I stared at the glowing green audio wave graphic bouncing silently across my smartphone screen, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm of absolute anticipation. I opened the secure audio application and put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. For the first hour, there was nothing but the faint ambient static of an empty room. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured, waiting with the infinite patience of a hunter in a blind. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the audio feed crackled to life. The voice activation software had detected movement. I heard the sharp, distinct sound of high heels clicking against the hardwood floor, followed by the heavier, dragging footsteps of my son. I heard the scraping of heavy wooden chairs being pulled back from the mahogany table. They were sitting down for dinner. I closed my eyes, focusing my entire mind on the crystal-clear audio streaming directly into my ears. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain plates echoed through the headphones. For a few minutes, they ate in total silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet that spoke volumes about the toxic state of their marriage. Then the silence broke. Monica slammed her fork down onto her plate with a sharp, violent clatter that made me flinch. The sound was immediately followed by a sharp intake of breath from Derek. "You need to call the general contractor right now and tell him to double the crew size tomorrow," Monica demanded, her voice completely stripped of the sweet, melodic tone she used in public. Her true voice was harsh, piercing, and laced with absolute venom. "They are moving entirely too slow. At this pace, the plumbing will not pass county inspection until next month. We do not have until next month, Derek." The bank sent another warning notice to my email today. They are preparing the final default paperwork. If we do not have paying guests in that rental unit within 3 weeks, we are going to lose everything. I listened as Derek let out a pathetic, trembling sigh. His voice, when he finally spoke, was so weak and submissive that it made my stomach turn. "I cannot force the contractors to work faster, Monica," he pleaded, but sounding like a terrified child rather than a grown man. "They are already demanding the second installment payment for the materials. We gave them the $10,000 we got from the scrap dealer, but they want another $15,000 by Friday. My credit cards are completely maxed out. I cannot pull another cash advance, and I cannot ask my firm for an advance on my bonus. We have absolutely zero liquidity left. What do you want me to do?" I heard the sound of Monica standing up her chair, scraping violently against the floor. I could hear the aggressive pacing of her heels as she circled the dining table, trapping him like a predator circling wounded prey. Derek's breathing grew ragged and uneven, echoing loudly through the highly sensitive microphone. "What do I want you to do?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifying, venomous whisper. "I want you to act like a man for once in your miserable life. I want you to fix the disaster your stupid father is causing by simply refusing to die. If you had just convinced him to sell this massive useless property a year ago, like I told you to, we would not have had to forge that document. We would not have had to borrow that money, and my brother would not have been able to steal it from us. This is entirely your fault, Derek. You are weak. You are a coward. You let that old man dictate our lives, and now we are paying the price. You better find a way to get that $15,000 by Friday, even if you have to steal it from his personal checking account. I sat in the darkness, the venomous words pouring into my ears. The dynamic between them was not a marriage. It was a hostage situation. She despised him, and he was completely paralyzed by his fear of her. I listened to my son whimper and apologize to the woman who was actively destroying him. I felt a cold, hard disgust replace any lingering traces of paternal sympathy. The audio feed crackled again as Monica continued her relentless verbal assault, and I braced myself knowing that the worst of her dark secrets was about to be laid completely bare. The audio feed crackled again as Monica continued her relentless verbal assault, and I braced myself, knowing that the worst of her dark secrets was about to be laid completely bare. I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a zipper being pulled down violently, followed by the heavy thud of a dining chair scraping against the floorboards. Monica groaned loudly, an ugly guttural sound of pure physical frustration that completely contradicted her usual poised public persona. She muttered a harsh curse under her breath, and then I heard a strange, heavy tearing noise. It sounded exactly like thick bands of industrial Velcro being ripped apart with aggressive force. I sat completely still in the darkness of my room, adjusting the volume on my headphones, trying to visualize exactly what was happening in the dining room, just a few hundred feet away from my quiet suite. Derek let out a pathetic, pleading whine. "Monica, please," he begged, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of fear and exhaustion. "You cannot just take that off in the middle of the house. What if my father walks in? What if he sees you? He has a key to the back door. If he walks into the kitchen and sees you taking that off, everything is over. We will lose the house immediately. He will call the police, or worse, he will call his lawyers and throw us out onto the street tonight. Please just put it back on until we get upstairs to the master bedroom. I do not care about your stupid father right now." Monica snapped back, her voice dripping with venomous contempt. The heavy thud of something soft but dense hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the sensitive microphone. "It is suffocating me, Derek. Do you have any idea how insanely hot and uncomfortable it is to wear a 10-pound silicone prosthetic belly strapped tightly around your waist for 14 hours a day? The medical-grade adhesive is causing a severe rash on my skin, and the lower back pain is absolutely excruciating. I have been sweating under layers of maternity clothes all afternoon, just to keep up this miserable performance for your benefit and for his. I am taking it off, and I am leaving it off until tomorrow morning. If your father walks in, you will just distract him. Tell him I went to bed early. You are supposed to be a man, so act like one and handle it." I stopped breathing. The air in my small living room suddenly felt freezing cold. I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, my mind struggling to process the sheer monstrous reality of the words I had just heard. A 10-pound silicone prosthetic belly. She had unstrapped a fake pregnancy belly and thrown it onto the dining room floor. The grand, joyful announcement they had made 3 months ago, the ultrasound pictures they had proudly displayed on the refrigerator, the glowing maternity dresses she wore around the estate. It was all a complete and absolute lie. There was no baby. There was no grandchild. The entire pregnancy was a meticulously crafted sociopathic fabrication. I listened as Derek paced nervously back and forth across the dining room rug. "I hate this," he whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of their massive deception. "I hate lying to him about a child. When you told me you were pregnant, I actually believed we were going to build a real family. I thought we were going to turn things around. But you only used it to force me into forging that bank document. You told me we needed the money for the baby. You told me we had to secure our future for the child. And then, when my father came home from Oregon, you used the exact same lie to steal his workshop. You used an unborn child as a weapon to make him surrender his life work without a fight. It makes me sick. Monica let out a cruel, mocking laugh. It was a sound devoid of any human empathy. Of course I used it, she spat back, completely unrepentant. It was the perfect strategy. Your father is a weak, sentimental old fool. He would have fought us to the bitter end over that stupid workshop if we just told him we wanted to build a rental unit. He would have demanded to see our finances, and he would have discovered the missing $600,000 in a matter of days. But the moment I placed my hand on my stomach and told him that the baby needed a safe, toxin-free environment, he folded like a cheap suit. He could not argue against the safety of his own supposed grandchild. It paralyzed him with guilt, and it gave us the moral high ground. It was the only way to get him out of that building fast enough for the contractors to begin the demolition. The profound darkness of her manipulation washed over me in crushing waves. She had not only forged my signature and stolen my equity, but she had actively weaponized my deepest paternal instincts against me. She knew that I mourned the fact that Patty had not lived long enough to see a grandchild. She knew that I would do absolutely anything to protect the next generation of our family. She had calculated my love, quantified my grief, and used it as a psychological crowbar to pry me away from my sanctuary. She had created a fictional life just to fund her criminal desperation. Her lack of basic human decency was astonishing. And you, Derek, Monica continued, her voice lowering into a deadly, threatening hiss. You went along with it because you had absolutely no other choice. Do not stand there and try to claim the moral high ground now. When my brother disappeared with the money, you were the one who panicked. You were the one who was terrified of going to federal prison for bank fraud. I gave you a solution. I gave you the pregnancy narrative so you could convince yourself that you were doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. I gave you an excuse to finally take control of this estate. So do not whine to me about your guilty conscience. You are in this just as deep as I am. We need the cash flow from that Airbnb to cover the interest payments on the forged loan, and we need it immediately. So pick up that prosthetic belly, hide it in the closet upstairs, and figure out how to get the contractor his $15,000 by Friday. I heard the reluctant, shuffling footsteps of my son as he walked across the room. I heard the soft rustle of the silicone prosthetic being lifted from the floor. He did not argue. He did not defend me. He simply accepted his role as the obedient accomplice to a monster. He had allowed his wife to invent a fake child to steal his father's home, and he was too much of a coward to stop her. His silence spoke louder than any of her vicious insults. I slowly reached up and removed the headphones, placing them gently onto the coffee table. The silence of my small suite rushed back in heavy and absolute. I did not feel rage anymore. The anger had burned completely through my nervous system, leaving behind a cold, desolate wasteland of pure rationality. The last remaining tether of familial loyalty I held for my son snapped, severing cleanly and permanently. He was no longer my child. He was an active, willing participant in my destruction. I leaned back in my chair and stared into the darkness. The fake pregnancy was the final fatal mistake they had made. It was the ultimate leverage I needed. They had built an entire house of cards on the foundation of a fictional baby. They had invited their friends over, accepted congratulations, and paraded their fake joy in front of the world. The social humiliation that would fall upon them when the truth was exposed would be catastrophic. Monica cared about her public image more than anything else in her shallow existence. Her status, her reputation, and her perceived wealth were the only things that gave her life meaning. She had handed me the tool to destroy all of it. I stood up and walked over to the small window looking out at the darkened main house. The master bedroom light flickered on as they retreated upstairs to hide the silicone belly. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought their psychological manipulation was a stroke of pure genius. But they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to utterly dismantle their entire reality. I did not just have evidence of their financial crimes now. I had the undeniable proof of their sociopathic depravity. I saved the audio file to my phone. They had no idea what was coming. Have you ever considered confronting family members about their manipulations before it escalated to such extremes? I thought the horrifying revelations had concluded for the evening. My thumb hovered over the glowing red button on my phone screen, fully intending to terminate the secure application and disconnect the live audio feed. But before I could press the glass, the faint sound of heavy glass clinking against wood echoed through my noise-canceling headphones. The microphone hidden beneath the dining room table picked up the unmistakable sound of liquid being poured. Derek had not followed his wife up the stairs. He had lingered behind, moving toward the antique crystal decanter I kept on the side console. I heard him take a long, desperate swallow, the sharp intake of breath revealing the burning bite of straight whiskey hitting the back of his throat. He poured another glass. He was trying to numb the reality of the nightmare he had allowed his wife to create. Then the sharp tapping of Monica's heels returned. She had come back down the stairs, likely noticing his absence. The sheer, terrifying weight of her presence seemed to compress the audio feed itself. I heard her stop a few feet away from where Derek was standing. She let out a sharp, irritated sigh. "You cannot just stand here drinking yourself into a stupor, Derek," she commanded, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "We still have the biggest obstacle to manage. The contractor deposit is just a temporary bandage. We still have to deal with the inevitable explosion when your father realizes the true extent of the workshop demolition." Derek slammed his glass down onto the table. The sudden violence of the action surprised me. "Monica, he is going to find out about the loan," he whispered frantically, panic radiating from every syllable. "We can build the rental unit. We can scrape together the interest payments, but we cannot hide a $600,000 lien from the actual property owner forever." The property tax assessments arrive in the mail. Bank statements exist. Eventually, he will try to access a line of equity for himself, or he will want to sell a parcel of the land. When he discovers the forgery, he will completely destroy us. We are just delaying our own prison sentences. I sat perfectly still, the cold darkness of my suite pressing against my shoulders. My son was finally voicing the inescapable truth of their situation. I waited for Monica to panic, to show a single crack in her sociopathic armor. Instead, she laughed. It was a soft, chilling sound of absolute predatory confidence. "You really think I would initiate a plan of this magnitude without an exit strategy?" she asked, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, deadly whisper. "You think I am just blindly hoping the old man stays oblivious until he dies?" Derek already engineered the final solution to our problem. We are not just going to manage his anger over the workshop. We are going to intentionally weaponize it. We are going to use his outrage to legally and permanently neutralize him. The whiskey glass scraped across the mahogany table as Derek shifted his weight. "What are you talking about, Monica? How do you neutralize my father?" I listened intently, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Monica outlined a plot so profoundly evil, so meticulously cruel, that it made the theft of my machinery seem like a harmless misunderstanding. "I have been in contact with a medical professional," she revealed smoothly. "A psychiatrist named Dr. Eris. He operates a private, very discreet clinic on the east side of the city. He ran in the same circles as my brother Julian, and he is extremely motivated by financial incentives. He understands our unique situation, and he has agreed to provide us with a very specific, binding medical diagnosis. But he needs documentation to justify his evaluation. He needs physical evidence, evidence of what Derek demanded, his voice thick with confusion and rising terror. Evidence of severe, aggressive, and rapid onset dementia," Monica stated coldly. "Here is exactly what is going to happen, Derek. Tomorrow morning, when the demolition crew arrives to tear down the remaining structural supports of his precious workshop, I am going to make sure your father is standing right there on the patio. I am going to push him. I am going to insult his tools, mock his legacy, and casually mention that we threw his favorite woodworking pieces into the local landfill. I am going to provoke him until he absolutely loses his mind with rage. And while he is screaming, throwing things, and acting like a violent lunatic, I am going to record the entire meltdown on my phone. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning stark white. The sheer psychological cruelty of her plan was breathtaking. She wanted to deliberately inflict maximum emotional trauma upon me solely to capture my devastated reaction on video. Once we have the footage of him acting violent and irrational, Monica continued, her tone brisk and businesslike. We take the video directly to Dr. Aris. He will review the footage, consult the medical history we provide, and officially diagnose your father as a severe danger to himself and others. The doctor will sign a sworn affidavit declaring that William Caldwell is suffering from advanced hostile dementia and is completely incapable of managing his own affairs or living independently. But we cannot just force him into a doctor's office, Derek protested weakly, sounding as though he was drowning in the sheer depravity of the scheme. He will never consent to a psychiatric evaluation. He will demand his own lawyers. He will call Evelyn Reed. He will not have the legal capacity to demand anything. Monica snapped, her patience completely evaporating. Have you forgotten the legal documents you already possess, Derek? We still have the original medical power of attorney, the one he willingly signed and handed to you before his heart surgery. The document that explicitly gives you the absolute legal right to make binding healthcare and psychiatric decisions on his behalf if he is deemed medically incompetent. A wave of nausea washed over me. I remembered handing my son that document. I remembered looking into his eyes, trusting him to protect me when I was at my most vulnerable. Monica had not only used that trust to forge a financial theft, but she was now planning to use the legitimate medical proxy to completely erase my human rights. Dr. Aris will sign the incompetency order, Monica explained, laying out the terrifying endgame. With that medical order and your active power of attorney, we will have your father legally and involuntarily committed to a secure state-run nursing facility. I have already researched several minimum care institutions. They are cheap, highly secure, and heavily medicated. Once he is processed into the locked memory care ward, his cell phone will be confiscated. His communication will be restricted. He will not be allowed to contact Evelyn Reed, and if he tries to tell the nurses that his son stole his money, they will simply document it as a paranoid delusion caused by his aggressive dementia. No one will believe a single word he says. He will be locked away in a sterile white room, completely medicated, until the day he finally dies. The silence that followed her statement was absolute. The monstrous reality of her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They were planning to steal my freedom, my mind, and my voice. They were planning to bury me alive inside a psychiatric prison just to cover up their financial crimes. And once he is committed, Monica concluded, her voice dripping with triumphant greed, we take full, uncontested control of the entire estate. With the medical incompetency ruling, the trust provisions will allow you to act as the sole managing trustee. We will immediately list the Bellevue property for sale. The real estate market is booming. We can sell this estate for over $3 million in cash. We pay off the $600,000 bank loan, effectively wiping out the evidence of our forgery. We pocket the remaining millions, and we leave this miserable reigning city behind forever. We can move to the coast, buy a beautiful home in a tropical country, and live exactly the way we are supposed to live. Derek did not argue. He did not defend the man who had raised him, fed him, and loved him. He simply let out a long, trembling sigh. It is the only way, he whispered, confirming his absolute complicity in my planned destruction. If we do not put him away, we will go to federal prison. We have to commit him. We have to sell the house. I sat in the cold darkness of my suite, the headphones pressing against my ears. The recording device captured the sound of their retreating footsteps as they finally walked up the stairs to the master bedroom, leaving the dining room silent once more. I reached out and slowly pressed the red button on my phone screen, stopping the live feed and permanently saving the audio file to my secure encrypted server. My heart was no longer racing. My hands were no longer shaking. Every trace of fear, shock, and parental sorrow had been completely eradicated from my soul, replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. They had crossed the final boundary separating human greed from pure, irredeemable evil. They were not merely thieves trying to hide a desperate mistake. They were predators planning to psychologically torture me, strip away my fundamental human rights, and lock me in a medicated prison cell to rot while they financed a tropical vacation with my life savings. They had no idea what was coming. I placed the phone down and smiled. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce through the heavy gray clouds when I finally stood up from my chair. I had not slept a single minute yet. I felt an extraordinary surge of boundless electric energy flowing through my veins. I packed the micro voice recorder, my smartphone, and the printed bank documents into a sturdy leather briefcase. I stepped out of my suite, moving with quiet, deliberate purpose across the damp morning grass. I did not look at the main house. I did not look at the gutted workshop. I simply got into my truck, turned the ignition, and drove away from the estate before Derek and Monica even had the chance to wake up and begin their performance for the day. I arrived at the downtown Seattle law office of Evelyn Reed exactly at 8 in the morning. She was already waiting for me in the lobby, dressed in a sharp navy suit and holding a thick, securely sealed legal portfolio. She took one look at my face and immediately knew that the situation had escalated far beyond simple financial theft. We walked into her private conference room, and I placed my phone on the polished mahogany table. I told her to listen to the audio file I had captured during the night. I watched her expression shift from professional concern to absolute horrified disgust as Monica detailed her psychotic plan to weaponize my anger, manufacture a fraudulent psychiatric diagnosis, and lock me inside a state-run nursing facility to rot. Evelyn did not say a single word when the recording finally ended. She simply reached across the table, picked up the phone, and transferred the audio file to an encrypted external hard drive. She looked at me with cold, uncompromising fury in her eyes. She stated that we were no longer just dealing with a standard case of elder financial abuse or a simple forged loan document. We were dealing with a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, and the attempted unlawful deprivation of my fundamental human rights. She grabbed her leather briefcase, locked the external hard drive inside, and told me that we were bypassing the local police department entirely. We were taking this massive conspiracy straight to the federal government. We drove together in her luxury sedan to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, located in the heart of the city. The security protocols were strict, but Evelyn possessed the kind of fierce, authoritative presence that immediately commanded respect. She requested an urgent audience with a senior special agent in the white-collar crimes division. We were escorted into a stark, windowless interrogation room featuring bright fluorescent lights and a heavy steel table. A tall, sharply dressed federal agent named Harrison entered the room, introduced himself, and sat down across from us. He opened a blank notepad, clicking his pen with a brisk professional efficiency. He asked us to explain exactly why we had demanded an emergency meeting with the federal authorities this morning. Evelyn took the lead, operating with surgical legal precision. She laid out the entire timeline of the fraudulent home equity line of credit. She presented the original medical proxy I had signed 3 years ago, followed immediately by the forged financial document Derek had submitted to the National Bank. She handed Agent Harrison the comprehensive shadow audit report generated by Tom, detailing exactly how the $600,000 had been systematically wired into an offshore cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme operated by Monica and her fugitive brother. Finally, I placed the encrypted hard drive onto the steel table and played the audio recording from the dining room. Agent Harrison listened to the entire conversation in absolute stony silence. He heard Monica casually discuss the fake silicone pregnancy belly. He heard her explicitly admit to the bank fraud. He heard her lay out the terrifying, calculated plot to bribe a corrupt psychiatrist and have me involuntarily committed to a locked memory care ward. When the audio finished playing, the agent closed his notepad and leaned back in his chair. The professional detachment had vanished from his face, replaced by a grim, hard realization of the sheer depravity involved. He confirmed that the evidence we provided was overwhelming. He stated that the forgery and the subsequent wire transfers constituted multiple federal felonies, each carrying a maximum sentence of 30 years in federal prison. Agent Harrison explained the immediate next steps of their operation. He instructed me to return to the estate and maintain my current routine. He explicitly warned me not to confront Derek or Monica, not to alter my behavior, and not to give them any indication that the federal government was now actively building a massive criminal case against them. The Bureau needed a few days to subpoena the official banking records, authenticate the forged notary stamp, and secure the necessary arrest warrants from a federal judge. He assured me that when they finally moved in to make the arrests, it would be swift, overwhelming, and absolute. I shook his hand, thanking him for his time, and walked out of the federal building with Evelyn by my side. The criminal justice system was now fully engaged, but I needed to secure my personal financial fortress immediately. We returned to the law office of Evelyn Reed to execute a complete and total legal lockdown. I sat across from her desk and signed a series of sweeping, ironclad legal documents. I officially and permanently revoked every single power of attorney that had ever been issued in my name, including the original medical proxy I had trusted Derek with 3 years ago. Evelyn immediately filed the revocation orders with the county clerk, ensuring that my son no longer held the legal authority to sign for a glass of water on my behalf, let alone a binding financial contract. We did not stop there. Evelyn contacted the 3 major credit bureaus and placed an absolute impenetrable security freeze on my Social Security number to stop them. She drafted an urgent certified legal notice to the National Bank Internal Fraud Division, formally declaring the $600,000 home equity line of credit as a verified criminal forgery, currently under active federal investigation. This maneuver legally paralyzed the account, preventing the bank from initiating their threatened foreclosure proceedings while the federal agents built their criminal case. In less than 2 hours, Evelyn had completely severed my son and daughter-in-law from my financial existence. They were entirely cut off, floating blindly in a void they did not yet realize existed. With the legal and criminal traps firmly set into place, I had one final crucial preparation to make. The federal authorities were going to handle the bank fraud crimes, but the destruction of my 40-year-old workshop was a deeply personal violation that required a deeply personal response. I left the law office and drove to a commercial equipment rental facility on the industrial side of the city. I walked into the loud, dusty dispatch office and asked to speak directly with the heavy machinery foreman. I needed to hire a specialized demolition crew for a highly specific surgical strike on my own property. I sat down with the foreman, a burly, weathered man who appreciated clear instructions and upfront payments. I unrolled a printed satellite map of my Bellevue estate onto his desk. I pointed directly to the structure that used to be my sanctuary. I explained what I needed. I explained that an unauthorized commercial renovation was taking place inside that building, and I needed it completely leveled to the ground. I did not want a careful deconstruction. I did not want the materials salvaged or preserved in any way. I wanted a heavy-duty bulldozer to drive straight through the newly framed walls and crush the expensive commercial plumbing they had just installed. I wanted the fake rental unit absolutely eradicated from my land, reduced to nothing but broken wood and shattered concrete. The foreman looked at the map, then up at me, and asked exactly when I wanted the demolition to take place. I smiled, a cold, hard expression forming on my face. I told him I needed the bulldozer to crash through the backyard gates exactly at 2 p.m. this upcoming Saturday. I knew for a fact that Monica had scheduled a massive catered gender reveal party in the backyard for that exact date and time. She had invited dozens of her shallow, wealthy friends to celebrate a baby that did not exist, hoping to collect envelopes of cash to help cover her fraudulent contractor debts. I wanted her entire world to violently collapse in front of an audience. I paid the foreman $10,000 in cash, permanently securing the heavy demolition crew for the weekend. The legal and physical trap was perfectly set. I went home to wait for Saturday to arrive. The remaining days of the week passed in a surreal, quiet blur. I walked around the estate watching the heavy construction trucks come and go, bringing stacks of expensive drywall and premium plumbing fixtures into my ruined sanctuary. I smiled at the workers. I smiled at Derek when we crossed paths in the kitchen. I even smiled at Monica when she complained about how exhausted her pregnancy was making her. I played the role of the defeated, clueless old man with absolute perfection. Every time she rubbed her fake silicone belly inside, I felt a deep, chilling satisfaction, knowing that her entire reality was about to violently collapse. By Saturday morning, the backyard of the estate had been completely transformed. Monica had spared absolutely no expense for her elaborate performance. A massive white catering tent was erected on the pristine lawn filled with tables draped in expensive silk linens. Crystal champagne flutes glittered under the pale Washington sun, and a string quartet was setting up their instruments near the patio. It was a sickening display of stolen wealth. She was throwing a lavish gender reveal party to celebrate a child that did not exist, funded entirely by credit cards that she had no intention of ever paying back. Her true goal, of course, was the massive pile of decorative envelopes piling up on the gift table. She had invited dozens of her shallow, affluent friends, hoping their generous cash gifts would help cover the mounting desperate debts she owed her contractors. At noon, the guests began to arrive. Luxury cars lined the long gravel driveway. Women in expensive designer dresses and men in tailored casual wear flooded onto the patio, carrying brightly wrapped packages and thick envelopes. Monica emerged from the main house wearing a flowing custom-made maternity gown that perfectly accentuated her fraudulent condition. She glided through the crowd, placing her hands delicately over the silicone prosthetic, accepting congratulations and compliments with the practiced grace of a seasoned actress. She looked absolutely radiant, radiating a maternal glow that was nothing more than a calculated sociopathic illusion. Derek trailed closely behind her, holding a glass of sparkling cider. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his smile was strained, and his eyes constantly darted toward the unfinished structure of the workshop. He knew the bank was closing in. He knew they were completely destitute. He was sweating through his expensive linen shirt, playing the role of the proud, expectant father, while silently suffocating under the weight of a massive federal felony. I stood quietly on the edge of the patio, holding a glass of iced tea, fading seamlessly into the background. A few guests offered me polite, condescending smiles, whispering to each other about how sweet it was that the grandfather was giving up his workshop for the new baby. I nodded politely, sipping my tea, checking my watch. It was 1:45 in the afternoon. The demolition crew was exactly 15 minutes away. Monica clapped her hands together, the sharp sound cutting through the gentle music of the string quartet. She gestured toward the center of the lawn, where a massive opaque black balloon was tethered to a decorative wooden arch. It was time for the main event. The guests cheered and gathered around in a large semicircle, holding up their smartphones to record the spectacle for their social media accounts. Monica grabbed Derek by the hand and pulled him into the center of the circle. She was handed a long, sharp golden pin by one of the caterers. "Thank you all so much for coming today," Monica announced, her voice projecting brightly across the yard. "Derek and I are just so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such amazing friends. As you all know, we have been working tirelessly to convert the old workshop into a beautiful, toxin-free sanctuary for our little angel. It has been a massive project. But looking at all of you here today, I know that every single sacrifice has been completely worth it." She turned and gave me a sickeningly sweet smile, gesturing toward where I stood on the patio. "And we owe a special thank you to Bill, who so generously gave up his dusty old hobby shop so his grandchild could have the absolute best environment possible." The crowd let out a collective sympathetic gasp, turning their phones toward me. I raised my glass of iced tea in a silent, mocking toast. My eyes drifted past the crowd, looking directly at the heavy wooden gates that secured the rear entrance of the estate. It was 1:58. The faint, deep rumble of a heavy diesel engine began to vibrate through the damp ground beneath my boots. It was a low, guttural growl that slowly grew louder, completely drowning out the delicate music of the string quartet. Several guests looked around in confusion, lowering their phones as the ground continued to shake. Monica frowned, her perfect smile faltering as the mechanical roar echoed through the trees. She held the golden pin suspended in the air, clearly annoyed by the sudden disruptive noise. Derek froze, his eyes widening in pure panic as he recognized the distinct sound of heavy industrial machinery. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy wooden gates at the back of the property violently exploded inward. The massive yellow steel blade of a commercial bulldozer smashed through the reinforced timber as if it were made of fragile glass. Splinters of wood showered across the grass. The guests shrieked in absolute terror, scattering in every direction as the towering machine roared onto the pristine lawn. Its massive metal tracks tore deep, muddy gashes into the expensive landscaping, completely destroying the perfectly manicured grass. Monica screamed, dropping the golden pin into the dirt. She stumbled backward, clutching her fake stomach in a panic, her designer dress dragging through the mud. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his jaw dropping open in shock as the heavy machinery advanced. The bulldozer did not slow down. It did not hesitate. The driver, following my strict prepaid instructions, bypassed the catering tent entirely and drove the massive machine straight toward the gutted shell of my former workshop. The roaring diesel engine drowned out the frantic screams of the wealthy guests. The bulldozer raised its heavy steel blade and slammed directly into the newly framed front wall of the commercial rental unit. The impact was deafening. The fresh timber snapped with a violent explosive crack. The pristine new drywall shattered into thousands of white powdery fragments, filling the air with a thick, choking dust. The machine pushed forward relentlessly, its metal tracks grinding over the debris, crushing the expensive custom windows they had just installed yesterday. I stood perfectly still on the patio, watching the absolute destruction of their fraudulent dream. It was a symphony of beautiful, chaotic justice. The bulldozer backed up the engine, roaring in a cloud of thick black exhaust, and rammed into the structure a second time. The entire roofline groaned and collapsed inward, sending a massive plume of dust and debris billowing across the yard. The heavy steel blade dropped down, tearing through the concrete floor and ripping up the newly laid commercial plumbing pipes. Water erupted from the broken lines, spraying wildly into the air and turning the ruined structure into a flooded, muddy disaster zone. Tens of thousands of dollars of stolen, borrowed money was being systematically reduced to absolute garbage in a matter of seconds. The catered party was in complete shambles. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments and fled toward the driveway. The guests were running toward their luxury cars, their expensive dresses covered in drywall dust and mud. The beautiful gift table had been knocked over in the panic, scattering the decorative envelopes across the wet grass. Monica fell to her knees in the mud, shrieking hysterically as she watched her luxury rental unit being pulverized into a pile of shattered timber and twisted metal pipes. She clawed at her hair completely, losing her mind as the bulldozer systematically erased her only hope of ever paying the federal bank loan. Derek collapsed to the ground right beside her, covering his face with his hands. He wept openly as the devastating consequences of his ultimate betrayal finally crashed down upon him. He knew exactly what this destruction meant. He knew the bank was going to foreclose on the property, and he knew he had absolutely no way to stop it. The music was dead. The party was over. Justice had arrived. I walked slowly across the ruined lawn, my heavy boots stepping right over the crushed remains of the black gender reveal balloon. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger. I simply stood tall over my son and my daughter-in-law, looking down at them as they sobbed in the cold dirt, entirely broken and completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the war they had foolishly started. The air was thick with settling drywall dust and the sharp smell of broken pine. I stepped onto the edge of the patio, moving with a calm, deliberate rhythm that completely defied the absolute chaos unfolding on the lawn. The guests were frozen in a state of suspended animation, their expensive clothing covered in white powder, staring at the massive yellow bulldozer idling in the center of the ruined workshop. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out the thick official envelope from the bank. The formal notice of default. I walked slowly toward the center of the yard, where Monica and Derek were still kneeling in the mud, completely overwhelmed by the catastrophic destruction of their fraudulent rental unit. Monica looked up at me, her flawless makeup smeared with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged fury. "Bill, what have you done?" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at the bulldozer. "Are you completely insane? You just destroyed everything." I stopped a few feet away from her. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the searing rage that had fueled me for the past week. I simply looked down at her with cold, absolute detachment. "I did not destroy anything, Monica," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "I simply removed an unauthorized illegal commercial structure from my property. You see, I finally read the mail." I tossed the thick envelope onto the muddy grass right at Derek's feet. The heavy paper landed with a soft thud. I nodded toward the document, instructing my son to open it. Derek stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His hands shook violently as he reached down and pulled the formal default notice from the heavy paper flap. He read the bold black text at the top of the page, his face draining of all color. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely incapable of forming a coherent word. "For the benefit of your guests," I announced, raising my voice slightly, so the crowd of wealthy friends could hear every single damning detail. "That document is a formal notice of default from a national bank. It states that the $600,000 home equity line of credit secured against this estate is severely delinquent. It also explicitly states that because the monthly interest payments have been missed, the bank is preparing to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Monica scrambled backward in the mud, her eyes darting frantically toward her friends, desperately trying to salvage her shattered public image. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice tight and defensive. "We had a financial setback, but we were fixing it. We were building the rental unit to generate passive income. We were going to pay the bank. We just needed a little more time." I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I did not respond to her pathetic excuses. I tapped the screen, pairing the device with the powerful high-end Bluetooth speaker sitting on the nearby catering table. I opened the encrypted audio file I had saved just 2 nights ago. "You did not need more time, Monica," I stated, my tone dropping to a low, lethal register. "You needed a miracle. Because you did not just fall behind on your bills. You actively forged my signature on a federal banking document to steal $600,000 of my hard-earned equity. And then you handed every single penny of that stolen money to your brother Julian, who dumped it into a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme and vanished into thin air." The silence in the yard was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. I pressed the play button on my phone. The crystal-clear audio blasted through the powerful Bluetooth speaker, echoing loudly across the muddy lawn. The guests heard the distinct sound of a zipper being pulled down, followed by the heavy thud of the dining chair. They heard Monica groan loudly, complaining about the sheer physical discomfort of her situation. And then her venomous voice filled the air. "It is suffocating me, Derek. Do you have any idea how insanely hot and uncomfortable it is to wear a 10-pound silicone prosthetic belly strapped tightly around your waist for 14 hours a day? The medical-grade adhesive is causing a severe rash on my skin." The audio continued to play, exposing every dark, sociopathic corner of her deception. The guests heard her admit to faking the pregnancy to guilt-trip my son. They heard her boast about weaponizing an unborn child to force me out of my workshop. They heard her brutally mock the concept of family treating my sanctuary as nothing more than a temporary obstacle in her desperate scramble for cash. I stopped the recording. Derek dropped the bank notice into the mud. He slowly turned his head, staring at his wife's stomach with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The realization hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. He had allowed himself to become a willing accomplice to a massive federal felony. He had risked 30 years in federal prison. He had betrayed his own father, forged binding legal documents, and mortgaged his entire future, all to provide for a child that completely and utterly did not exist. "Monica," he whispered, his voice cracking with a devastating, paralyzing grief. "You told me you were pregnant. You showed me the ultrasound pictures. You made me buy the crib." Monica scrambled backward, her hands flying defensively over the silicone prosthetic strapped beneath her expensive maternity gown. She looked frantically around the yard, realizing that her entire carefully constructed reality had been completely obliterated. Her friends were staring at her with profound disgust. Some were already walking quickly toward their luxury cars, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal crime. "It was the only way, Derek." She shrieked, her voice hitting a hysterical, panicked pitch. "We needed the money. We needed the lifestyle. I had to give you a reason to sign that paper. I had to give you a reason to fight your father. I did it for us." I stepped forward, towering over them both. "You did it for yourself, Monica," I corrected her, my voice cold and absolute. "You weaponized a fake child to steal my home. You forged my signature to steal my money. And when your own brother stole that money from you, you decided that the best way to cover up your crimes was to manufacture a fraudulent psychiatric diagnosis and lock me inside a state-run memory care facility until I died." Derek flinched as if he had been physically struck. He looked up at me, the final remnants of his denial shattering completely. "Dad," he pleaded, tears streaming down his pale face. "I did not know about the psychiatric plan. I swear to you, I did not know she was going to commit you. I just wanted to pay the bank. I just wanted to fix the mistake." I looked down at my son. I saw the desperate, terrified little boy hidden beneath the expensive suit and the mountain of debt. But pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. "You chose your path, Derek," I said softly. "You chose to protect a monster instead of protecting your father. And now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." A faint, high-pitched wailing sound began to drift through the crisp afternoon air. The sound grew louder, sharper, cutting through the heavy silence of the ruined backyard. Sirens. Multiple sirens approaching rapidly from the main road. Monica froze, her eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden gates at the front of the estate. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels sinking deeply into the soft mud. She grabbed Derek by the arm, pulling frantically at his sleeve. "We have to go," she screamed, pure terror completely consuming her face. "Derek, get up. We have to leave right now." Derek did not move. He remained on his knees, eyes in the mud, staring blankly at the shattered remains of the workshop. He knew it was over. He knew there was absolutely nowhere left to run. 3 dark, unmarked federal SUVs swerved violently through the open gates, their red and blue emergency lights flashing brilliantly against the gray Washington sky. The vehicles came to a sharp, aggressive halt on the gravel driveway. The heavy doors swung open, and 6 federal agents stepped out, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. Agent Harrison, the man I had spoken with at the field office, walked purposefully across the lawn. He bypassed the fleeing guests and marched straight toward the center of the patio. He did not draw his weapon, but his presence commanded absolute, terrifying authority. "Monica Caldwell," he announced, his voice booming across the yard. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, and the unauthorized forgery of federal financial documents." Monica backed away, her hands raised defensively in the air. "This is a mistake," she cried out, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "I did not forge anything. My husband signed those papers. Derek is the one with the power of attorney. He is the one who approved the loan." Agent Harrison did not flinch. He signaled to two female agents who stepped forward, grabbing Monica firmly by the arms. They pulled her hands behind her back, the sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing loudly over the fading sirens. "We have the digital metadata," Monica Agent Harrison stated coldly. "We have the wire transfer logs to the offshore cryptocurrency exchange. And thanks to your father-in-law, we have a pristine audio recording of you openly admitting to the entire criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." They led her away, her designer maternity gown dragging through the thick mud, her frantic screams for Derek echoing into the distance. She was completely broken, her illusion of wealth and status permanently shattered by the cold, unforgiving reality of federal law enforcement. Agent Harrison turned his attention to my son. Derek remained on his knees, his head bowed in absolute defeat. "Derek Caldwell," the agent said, his tone slightly less aggressive, but equally firm. "We have an active warrant for your arrest as a willing accomplice to these federal crimes. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Derek slowly rose to his feet. He did not resist. He did not argue. He simply offered his wrists to the federal agent. As the cold steel locked around his hands, he turned his head and looked at me one final time. "I am so sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice completely broken. "I am so incredibly sorry." I stood perfectly still, watching the federal agents lead my only son away toward the dark SUVs. The heavy doors slammed shut, enclosing him in the catastrophic consequences of his own cowardice. The vehicles reversed smoothly out of the driveway, their flashing lights disappearing down the long, winding road, leaving me standing alone in the center of my ruined estate. The war was officially over. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles painted the damp afternoon in harsh shades of red and blue, as Monica was forcefully guided toward the last transport. She thrashed against the physical restraint of the agents, her expensive maternity dress ruined, smeared with thick mud. Her desperate screams for her husband echoed across the sprawling estate, growing increasingly frantic as the heavy steel door of the armored vehicle slammed shut, cutting off her voice. The engine roared to life and the transport reversed down the gravel driveway, taking the architect of my destruction far away. Derek was not placed in the back of the federal vehicle. Agent Harrison had informed me earlier that my son would face a separate indictment hearing later in the week, allowing me the final moment to remove him on my own terms. Derek remained on his knees in the cold dirt, surrounded by the shattered remains of the illegal rental unit he had tried to build. He looked up at me, his eyes swollen and bloodshot, stripped of the arrogant corporate executive persona he had worn for years. "Dad," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Please do not do this. I have nothing left. My wife is going to federal prison. My career is completely destroyed. The bank is going to take everything. I am begging you, let me stay here. I can fix this. I will work for you. I will pay back every penny we took. Just give me one more chance." I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a crisp single sheet of paper, prepared by Evelyn Reed. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer him a single ounce of paternal comfort. I looked down at the broken man who had allowed his wife to plan my involuntary psychiatric commitment. "I am not a bank. Derek," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "I am not a safety net for criminals." I dropped the formal legal document directly onto his muddy knees. "That piece of paper is a binding eviction notice. You have until exactly 5 in the afternoon to pack whatever fits into your luxury car and permanently vacate my estate. If you are still standing on this property at 1 minute past 5, I will personally call Agent Harrison and press additional accomplice charges. You chose your wife. You chose the lies. Now you get to live with the absolute consequences." Derek stared at the eviction notice, his entire body trembling violently. He realized there was no negotiation. There was no remaining shred of guilt he could weaponize. He slowly stood up, turning his back to me, and walked heavily toward the main house to pack his bags. I did not watch him leave. I turned my attention to the ruined workshop, ready to finally begin the quiet process of true restoration. Fast forward 6 months, and the dark clouds that had choked my estate finally lifted. The bank fraud investigation was cleared up by federal agents completely exonerating me from the massive debt Monica had fraudulently secured in my name. The $600,000 lien was stripped from my property title, restoring my estate to its rightful status. Monica was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and forgery. Derek pled guilty to lesser accomplice charges and was currently serving a 3-year sentence. I simply closed that dark chapter and moved forward. The backyard of the Bellevue estate was no longer a disaster zone. I hired a team of specialized local contractors to rebuild my sanctuary from the ground up. The new workshop was even more magnificent than the original. It featured towering ceilings, massive skylights that bathed the smooth concrete floors in natural sunlight, and an industrial dust collection system. I meticulously replaced every piece of heavy machinery they had stolen from me, upgrading to the finest precision tools available. The comforting aroma of fresh cedar had finally returned, filling my lungs with absolute peace. But I did not just rebuild the workshop for myself. The betrayal I had suffered forced me to reevaluate the true purpose of my legacy. I realized that hoarding my skills and my wealth behind locked doors was a profound waste. I used a significant portion of my remaining financial assets to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to teaching the intricate art of traditional woodworking to local at-risk youth. Twice a week, the heavy steel doors of my new sanctuary opened to welcome a dozen teenagers who needed a safe environment. I taught them how to respect the timber, how to measure twice and cut once, and how to build beautiful, lasting structures with their own 2 hands. Watching these kids find their focus, seeing the sheer pride light up their faces when they finished their first handmade project, brought a level of genuine joy to my heart that I had not felt since Patty passed away. I had lost a son to the toxic allure of greed and manipulation, but I had gained a grateful family of young apprentices who truly respected the value of honest labor. The estate was finally full of life, laughter, and purpose once again. As I stand in the center of my new workshop, listening to the rhythmic hum of the machinery and the chatter of my students, I understand that the darkest moments of our lives often serve as the catalyst for our greatest transformations. Family blood is not a free pass for betrayal. When someone shows you their true colors, believe them and use your mind, not your tears, to remove them from your life. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. If you found value in this video, please consider supporting the channel by sending a super thanks. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss the next story.